Before the next chapter begins, let us journey back to remember how this tale of faith, betrayal, and redemption first began. Once, under Roman rule, a young man named Judah Ben-Hur lived peacefully in Jerusalem until betrayal changed everything. His closest friend turned against him, and in the blink of an eye, he lost his home, his mother, his sister, everything. Wrongfully accused, he was torn from his past and chained to a Roman galley as a slave. Years passed. Beneath the crashing waves and endless toil at the oar, a fire of survival burned within him. In a fierce sea battle, fate offered him a chance. He saved a Roman commander's life, an act that would change his own. From the depths of suffering, he rose, not as a slave, but as a man reborn, adopted, honored, and given a new name in the eyes of Rome. But the scars of the past remained. Questions still haunted his heart. What became of his mother and sister? Was justice ever possible? And above all, what was the true path his life was meant to follow? As that search begins, so does the next chapter. The month to which we now come is July, the year that of our Lord 29. The city in focus was Antioch, known then as the Queen of the East. Towering in influence, it stood second only to Rome in strength and, perhaps, even surpassed her in sheer population. Many believe that the moral decay of the empire began in Rome and spread outward like a contagion, but others question that view. In truth, the conqueror had often absorbed the corruptions of the conquered. Greece offered temptations, so did Egypt, and in tracing the roots of moral decline, Antioch, a city ancient in its Assyrian splendor, seemed to many a more probable origin of this downward flow, as if the corruption had traveled westward from the east. On the blue waters of the mouth of the Orontes, a transport galley glided into the river. The sun was high, and though the heat was intense, many passengers had come on deck to catch the breeze. Among them was Judah Ben-Hur. The 5 years since his liberation had shaped him into the fullness of manhood. Dressed in a simple robe of white linen, his outward modesty concealed a striking presence. He sat beneath the sail shadow for over an hour, calmly distant, responding to his countrymen with a quiet politeness in refined Latin. His reserved manner and precise speech only deepened their curiosity. There was something noble in his posture, yet certain signs betrayed his past. His arms were long and powerful, and his hands, when grasping the nearby ropes to steady himself, appeared unusually strong. Observers sensed a contradiction, as if this man, elegant in bearing, had once belonged to another life. He seemed to carry a hidden tale within him, one marked not just by grace, but by endurance. Among the passengers was a dignified Hebrew, recently boarded from Cyprus. His gentle demeanor and quiet authority drew Judah's interest, and their conversation soon deepened. As the galley entered the Orontes, it passed 2 other vessels, each raising brilliant yellow flags. Passengers speculated on their meaning, and the elderly Hebrew explained. These were not symbols of nations, but of ownership. The owner, he revealed, was a wealthy merchant of Antioch, once affiliated with a noble family from Jerusalem named Hur. That family had suffered tragedy. Its patriarch lost at sea, and its only son condemned to the galleys after a failed attempt on the Roman procurator, Gratus. Their estate was seized. Their palace now stood abandoned. Yet from those ashes rose Simonides, once a servant, now a merchant of formidable reach. His business flourished, his caravans traveled far, and his ships, marked by those yellow flags, prospered beyond measure. Rumors swirled that his fortune was built on hidden wealth, perhaps safeguarded before the family's fall. The Roman governor, suspecting such, had tortured Simonides twice, leaving him broken in body but not in resolve. Today, with imperial license in hand, he operated freely, his yellow banners a quiet signal among sailors of voyages well made. When the vessel drew deeper into the river, Judah turned once more to the Hebrew, seeking quiet confirmation. The name of the merchant's former master? Ben-Hur, Prince of Jerusalem, and the fate of his family? The son was presumed dead in the galleys. The mother and daughter, likely lost in the silent dungeons of Judea, unseen, unspoken of. A shadow passed over Judah's face, but he said nothing. The river flowed on. Judah made his way toward the pilot's quarter, lost in a depth of thought so complete that he barely noticed the passing beauty around him. The riverbanks, stretching from sea to city, were adorned with orchards heavy with Syrian fruits and twisting vines, all gathered around villas as opulent as those in Neapolis. Yet none of it drew his attention. The vessels gliding past in an unbroken stream went unseen, just as the sailors' songs and shouts, whether from toil or cheer, passed unheard. The sky above was drenched in sunlight, its hazy warmth resting gently over land and water alike. But in his life alone, there lingered a shadow. Only once did his focus briefly return to the present. Someone pointed out the distant Grove of Daphne, just visible from a bend in the river, and for a fleeting moment, it stirred a flicker of interest within him. When the city finally appeared on the horizon, the passengers gathered on deck, their eyes wide with anticipation, eager not to miss a single detail of the unfolding view. Among them, a respectable Jew, already familiar to the observer, took the role of informal guide, offering insights with a calm, knowing voice. He spoke of how the river once brushed against the very walls of the city, but in the long years of peace under Roman rule, commerce had flourished, reshaping the riverbanks into a thriving expanse of docks and wharves. Pointing southward, he drew attention to Mount Casius, called by the locals the Mountains of Orontes, facing its northern twin, Amnus. Between the two rose the fertile plain of Antioch. Beyond them stood the dark silhouette of the Black Mountains, wild and untamed. Yet from them flowed the royal aqueducts that delivered clear, cool water to the thirsty streets below. These mountains remained dense forests, teeming with birds and untamed creatures. When someone inquired about the lake, the man gestured northward, explaining it could be reached either by horse or boat, the latter being easier due to a connecting tributary. When another asked about the famed Grove of Daphne, the man gave a knowing smile. Words could never do it justice, he explained. It was a place so enchanting, so divine, it was said even Apollo preferred it over Olympus. Visitors often entered just for a glance, only to be lost in its spell forever. The locals had a saying to describe its allure: better to live as a worm feeding on Daphne's mulberries than as a guest at a king's table. And despite its dangers, all came: philosophers, youths, women, even priests. So certain was he that newcomers would be drawn there, he advised them to avoid wasting time with city lodging and instead go straight to the village at the grove's edge. The path, he said, led through gardens and fountains, into a town filled with sanctuaries and shaded retreats, unlike anything else in the world. At last, he pointed to the city wall, a masterpiece by Zarius, famed for its architectural genius. The eyes of the listeners followed his hand. That section of the wall, he noted, had been built by order of the first Seleucid ruler, and 3 centuries had fused it into the very rock on which it stood. The fortifications stood proud, high and firm, stretching in bold angles as they curved out of sight. He described how 400 towers lined the top, each serving as a reservoir of water. In the distance, 2 distinct hills rose above the wall, twin peaks of Sulpius. On the farthest one, the Roman citadel stood, guarded year-round by a legion. Opposite it stood the temple of Jupiter, and beneath it, the legate's palace, a blend of administrative power and military strength, impervious even to mob fury. As the sailors began drawing in the sails, the Hebrew broke into a heartier tone. He He pointed to a bridge ahead, the boundary of river navigation. From there, goods moved on by camel. That very bridge marked the start of the island where Callinicus built his new city, connected by 5 massive viaducts that had stood unshaken by flood or earthquake. Of the main city itself, he offered only this. To see it once would be to carry its beauty in memory forever. The ship slowly turned toward its dock beside the massive wall. Life teemed along the riverfront. Activity, movement, trade. Ropes were thrown, the oars pulled in, and just like that, the voyage had ended. With purpose in his step, Ben-Hur approached the wise Hebrew and asked politely for one last favor before parting. He wished to know more about the merchant named Simonides. The man, sharp and cautious, clarified that Simonides was no mere moneylender. Ben-Hur reassured him that he sought no loan, only a meeting. After a thoughtful pause, the man explained that despite Simonides' great wealth, he kept his business in a building beneath the bridge, near the wall, unassuming from the outside, but always surrounded by cargo and moored fleets. There, Ben-Hur would surely find him. With brief blessings exchanged, they parted ways. Ben-Hur then gave orders to 2 porters carrying his luggage. He would head to the citadel, implying a connection with official or military matters. The city streets lay grand before him, divided by 2 wide avenues. When they passed the Nymphaeum, a massive fountain shrine at the foot of the southern road, Ben-Hur, though fresh from Rome, found himself stunned by the majesty. Marble colonnades stretched endlessly on both sides, separating paths for walkers, animals, and chariots, all shaded and cooled by gently flowing fountains. Yet his heart was elsewhere. The story of Simonides lingered in his thoughts. Reaching the Omphalos, a grand monument of arches built by the 8th Seleucid king, he suddenly changed his mind. He directed the porters toward a roadside inn, the nearest to the bridge on the Seleucia road. Soon after, he arrived at a modest yet spacious khan, a public lodging close enough to Simonides' quarters that he could begin his search at dawn. That night, lying on the rooftop beneath the stars, a quiet hope stirred within him. Perhaps now, at last, he would hear something of home, of his mother, and the dear little Tirzah. If they still walked this earth, he vowed he would find them. At daybreak, Ben-Hur turned his back on the wonders of the city and set his course toward a single purpose. He moved with quiet urgency along the riverbanks, passing under fortified gates and busy wharves, until he reached the Seleucian bridge. There, beneath its massive arch, stood the house of Simonides, a structure of uncut gray stone, rough and unadorned, seemingly fused into the very city wall behind it. The place resembled no known style of architecture. Its 2 enormous doors opened directly onto the wharf, where goods flowed in through one entrance and out through the other with relentless haste. A few barred openings near the top allowed for light and air, though they hardly softened the harshness of the stone, which bore streaks of moss and weeds clinging from its crevices. Outside, the scene pulsed with industry. Piles of cargo in every form lay stacked along the quay. Slaves moved among them, bare to the waist, engaged in the labor of loading and unloading. Beneath the bridge, galleys rocked gently on the current, their yellow flags fluttering as crews passed in noisy exchange between ship and shore. Above the bridge, across the river, an ornate palace loomed, its turrets and carvings crowding the island that had once been described so vividly. But Ben-Hur scarcely took notice. His mind was elsewhere, fixed on the man within the stone house. If Simonides had truly once been a servant in his father's household, would he now surrender everything he had gained? Could a man of such wealth and standing renounce it all and embrace the identity of a former slave? The mere thought felt audacious, almost offensive. Yet Ben-Hur pressed forward, grounded in a faith that the truth, if it existed, would prevail. If Simonides truly belonged to the house of Hur, then everything he possessed by justice, not greed, would rightfully return. Still, none of that mattered to Ben-Hur, not the fortune nor the fleets. All he desired was news of home. If only the merchant could speak of his mother and of little Tirzah, he would ask nothing more. With that in his heart, he stepped inside. The interior revealed a vast warehouse, dimly lit and filled with carefully arranged merchandise. Workers moved busily through the heavy air, crafting crates and preparing goods for shipment. As he walked the narrow lanes between the towering stacks, Ben-Hur's thoughts turned to the man behind it all. Could someone of such evident brilliance and order have once belonged to his household? Had he been born a servant, or fallen into bondage through debt or punishment? The questions lingered but never eroded the respect that grew with each step. Admiration, after all, often seeks reasons to justify itself. Eventually, a man approached and asked his purpose. Ben-Hur replied with quiet assurance, requesting to see Simonides. He was led through a maze of storerooms and up a stairway, emerging onto a rooftop terrace hidden from the view below. The space surprised him. It was alive with flowers, their fragrance softening the air. At the far end stood another structure, simple and squat, its stone walls surrounded by blooming Persian roses. A path, swept clean, led to its solitary doorway. He followed in silence, the scent of attar lingering in his breath. At the end of a dark hallway, the guide paused and announced his presence. A clear voice from within welcomed him in God's name. Inside, the room opened like a Roman atrium, lined with aged folios and finely carved wooden panels. The soft light filtering through a dome of violet mica above made the space feel both grand and serene. Thick gray rugs muffled every sound, adding to the stillness. In the center of the room sat two figures, a man reclined in a cushioned chair, and beside him a young woman, nearing womanhood, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. As Ben-Hur entered, he felt the color rise in his face. He bowed respectfully, missing the initial flicker of emotion that crossed the older man's features. A quick start, a brief stillness, but by the time Ben-Hur lifted his eyes again, the two were calmly watching him, unchanged but attentive. He offered a formal greeting, invoking peace upon the household, especially the girl. The merchant acknowledged both his name and heritage in a voice sharp and composed. The body beneath the robe was frail and sunken, but the head, broad and powerful, crowned with white hair, spoke of a man forged for leadership, one who would yield to nothing except matters of the heart. His face was pale and puffed, yet the eyes beneath the brows shone with undimmed strength. He was the kind of man who might endure pain silently and yet move empires with a glance. Ben-Hur extended his open hands in a gesture of peace. Calmly and without surprise, the merchant welcomed him, recognizing the house of Hur as one of ancient nobility. He instructed the girl, whom he addressed as Esther, to bring a seat for the visitor. Esther quietly fetched an ottoman and offered it with gentle words of peace. Their eyes met, though she had yet to understand the depth of Ben-Hur's mission. Her intuition sensed only that he carried a wound, emotional, not visible, and had come in search of healing. Still standing, Ben-Hur explained his reason for visiting. He had heard, only the day before, that Simonides had once known his father. The merchant confirmed the association, ventures of mutual profit, lawful and honorable, across distant lands. Then, inviting him to sit, he recalled the long lineage of the house of Hur, even citing scripture that spoke of their place in ancient Jerusalem. With a touch of wry formality, he offered wine, rich and pure, from the hills of Hebron. Though his body was broken, his hospitality remained full of dignity and pride. By the time the conversation drew to a close, Esther quietly stepped forward, holding a silver cup filled from a nearby vase. She offered it with her head gently lowered, her manner modest and reserved. But as Ben-Hur reached out and softly declined the drink, by touching her hand. Their eyes met once again. In that quiet moment, he observed how delicate she appeared, graceful, fair, and strikingly sweet in her expression, though she stood barely to his shoulder. Her soft black eyes held a depth that was impossible to ignore. She struck him as kind and lovely, a gentle soul not unlike Tirzah, had she still been alive. The memory of his sister stirred within him, one both tender and painful. Ben-Hur turned his attention back to Simonides, seeking clarity. He questioned the man's identity with care, acknowledging the possibility that the merchant before him might be the very same Simonides who once served his father long ago. The old man's body tensed beneath the folds of his robe, and his thin hand curled tightly, the emotion not entirely hidden. Simonides then called out to Esther, not softly, but with a sharp insistence that revealed both authority and protectiveness. Hearing him, she hesitated only a moment before setting the cup back on the table and obediently taking her place beside the chair. Her face, though composed, reflected both confusion and concern. The merchant placed his left hand into Esther's, which she held upon his shoulder with quiet affection. He spoke without heat, his voice marked by years of experience and disappointment. He admitted to having grown prematurely old through dealings with men, a life that had taught him distrust. If someone had spoken to Ben-Hur about his past with honesty and understanding, then surely that person had also made it clear that he was a man not easily moved to confidence. And yet, he acknowledged that he did still love, though sparingly. One such love was the soul whose hand now rested with his, a soul that had given him unselfish comfort for years, so much so that losing her would feel like the end of life itself. Esther lowered her head, allowing her cheek to rest against his shoulder. The other love, he explained with soft, trembling words, was merely a memory, but one sacred and expansive enough to embrace an entire family. The tragedy was, he admitted, not knowing where they were now. Ben-Hur felt a rush of emotion flood his face. He stepped forward, moved by a sudden, overwhelming hope, his thoughts leaping instantly to his mother and sister. But Simonides remained composed. He continued with calm precision, explaining that before answering anything about his possible connection to the house of Hur, there was a matter of justice that must come first. If Ben-Hur claimed such lineage, then he must present proof, either in written form or by a living witness. The demand was fair, its logic undeniable. But Ben-Hur faltered. His hands came together, and his voice faltered. He turned away, caught off guard by the question. The realization struck him with cruel finality. Those years chained to the galley had robbed him of everything. He no longer had a single piece of evidence to prove who he was. His mother and sister were gone. No one alive could verify his identity with certainty. People had known him once, yes, but none could truly speak for him now. And the one man who could, Quintus Arius, was gone, never to stand for him again. The weight of isolation pressed and harder than ever before, reaching into the very heart of him. He stood in silence, hands clasped, eyes averted, numb with helplessness. Simonides, recognizing the depth of his sorrow, remained respectfully quiet. At last, Ben-Hur gathered his composure and asked only that his story be heard. He would share all he could, if only Simonides would suspend judgment and listen with an open mind. Simonides, now fully in command of the moment, agreed without resistance. He even admitted that he had not denied the possibility that Ben-Hur was exactly who he claimed to be. Ben-Hur began his account, recounting his life with urgency, though every word was imbued with the quiet force of deeply held emotion. His story flowed quickly up to the moment of his return to Misenum alongside Arius, fresh from their victory in the Aegean. From there, he described how his benefactor, honored and trusted by the emperor, had been showered with rewards. Eastern merchants brought lavish gifts, and the noble Roman had risen to wealth among the elite of the empire. Yet even in the splendor of Rome, Ben-Hur never forgot his roots, his heritage, his faith, or the sacred land of his people. Though Arius adopted him through formal rites as a son, and though Ben-Hur honored him with the devotion of a true child, he refused to surrender his identity. He turned down offers of education in rhetoric and philosophy, choosing instead to remember the Lord God and the ancient glory of Zion. He had accepted the Romans' generosity not from opportunism, but love, and with the hope that such influence might one day help unlock the tragic mystery of his mother and sister's fate. There was, too, a deeper reason, unspoken but compelling enough to drive him toward the study of war. In both training grounds and battlefields, he earned distinction, though always under the name of Arius, the Duumvir. His trophies, many of them now displayed in the villa at Misenum, were claimed not as the son of Hur, but as a Roman heir. Pursuing his purpose without pause, he left Rome for Antioch, hoping to join the campaign against Parthia under Consul Maxentius. Skilled in combat, he now sought the greater wisdom of commanding legions. It was just the day before, as their ship entered the Orontes, that he saw vessels bearing yellow flags arriving beside theirs. A fellow traveler from Cyprus had casually explained that they belonged to Simonides, the famed Jewish merchant. He spoke of the man's great success, his vast caravans and fleets, and his Jewish heritage, adding, with no idea of Ben-Hur's personal stake, that Simonides had once served the house of Hur and had suffered under the brutalities inflicted by Gratus. The mention caused Simonides to bow his head, while Esther turned her face into his neck, hiding both her sympathy and sorrow. After a moment, the merchant composed himself and invited the story to continue, his voice clear and steady. Ben-Hur stepped forward once more, burdened by the feeling that he still stood in the shadow of suspicion. The expression of the merchant remained unmoved. Ben-Hur acknowledged the difficulty of his position. His Roman ties could be proven easily, as the consul was now in the city, but the more critical claim, that he was son to the Prince Hur, rested on evidence that no longer existed. Those who could have vouched for him were either lost or dead. Overcome, he covered his face with his hands, and Esther, moved with compassion, brought the cup he had earlier refused. Her gesture, so gentle and sincere, reflected the kindness of their shared homeland. He saw the tears in her eyes and accepted the drink, offering heartfelt thanks for the generosity extended not only to himself, but to the stranger he had become in his own story. Turning again to Simonides, Ben-Hur withdrew any claim to the merchant's wealth or past obligations. He had never sought repayment, nor did he desire it now. All that Simonides had built through toil and brilliance was his alone to keep. Ben-Hur had inherited great wealth from Arius and needed nothing. What brought him here, what had driven him to speak from the heart, was a single, aching question. What had become of his mother and his sister, Tirzah? If Simonides knew anything at all, he begged to be told. Esther's tears fell freely, but Simonides remained steadfast. He recalled the man Ben-Hur once was, and remembered well the tragedy that had befallen the family. The cruelty of Gratus had touched many lives, his own among them, and though he had made every effort to search for the lost women, there was nothing, no trace, no sign. They were gone. A cry of anguish escaped Ben-Hur. Another hope, like so many before, had crumbled. He bowed beneath the weight of it, his sorrow too familiar, his heart too bruised. He asked pardon for the intrusion, expressing regret if he had caused offense. He had come in hope, but left with only vengeance as his purpose. At the curtain, he turned briefly to thank them both. Simonides offered a quiet farewell. Esther could not find the words to speak through her sobs, and thus he departed. No sooner had Ben-Hur departed than Simonides appeared to awaken from a kind of slumber. His face, once still, became warm with color, and the dullness in his eyes gave way to a lively brightness. With a sudden burst of energy, he instructed Esther to summon assistance. Responding swiftly, she moved to the table and rang the bell. A concealed panel in the wall quietly shifted open, revealing a hidden doorway through which a man entered and approached the merchant with respectful greeting. Simonides, now fully alert, gave the man specific instructions with stern determination. He ordered him to follow the departing young man closely, closer even than his own shadow, and to observe everything: his whereabouts, his behavior, his companions. He was to report every detail each night, including conversations overheard, if possible, and anything that might expose the stranger's true nature. If the young man left the city, he was to follow him still, presenting himself as a companion rather than a spy. Under no condition was the man to reveal that he served Simonides. The instructions delivered, the man nodded in acknowledgement and quietly disappeared. Simonides, then alone with his daughter, rubbed his thin hands together and laughed with an almost childlike glee. In his joy, he asked Esther what day it was, claiming he wished to remember it for the happiness it brought. But the brightness in his demeanor sharply contrasted with Esther's somber spirit. To her, this date brought sorrow rather than joy, and she reminded her father that on this very day, 5 years earlier, her mother had died. The memory immediately subdued Simonides. His head dropped, his chin sinking into the folds of flesh around his neck, and in a voice softened by grief, he recalled how Rachel, his beloved wife, had passed away in sorrow, just as he had returned, himself broken. He remembered her beauty, her presence, and likened her to fragrant blossoms in a sacred vineyard. Though buried alone in a tomb cut in the mountains, she had left him one flickering light, which over the years had grown into a radiant morning: his daughter, Esther. As he laid his hand gently upon her head, he gave thanks that Rachel now lived again through her. Moments later, he lifted his head with a sudden thought and asked if the day outside was still clear. Upon hearing it was, he requested to be taken to the garden to look upon the river and the ships. He wished to share with Esther the reason behind his sudden laughter, his joyful spirit, and the lightness that filled his soul. A servant soon arrived and pushed his specially made wheelchair through a door and out to the rooftop garden. Rolling between roses and other carefully tended flowers, now unnoticed, they reached a spot from which he could see the island's palace rooftops, the bridge stretching into the distance, and the river below, teeming with ships gliding through sunlit waters. The servant then left, leaving Simonides and Esther alone in quiet company. Though the sounds of laborers shouting and pounding filled the air, and the heavy footsteps of travelers echoed from the bridge above, none of it disturbed Simonides. To him, those noises were as familiar and unremarkable as the sights before him, reminders only of the trade and profit they foretold. Esther sat beside him, gently holding his hand, waiting as his thoughts gathered. At last, with calm control, he began to speak. He had noticed Esther while the young man was present, and suspected that she had been moved by him. She admitted that she believed in his story and felt he might indeed be the lost son of Ben-Hur. Yet, even if he was not, she thought no deceit had ever worn such a noble disguise. Simonides, impressed by her conviction, questioned whether she believed him to be the prince's former servant. Esther recalled that the young man had only hinted at that, unsure himself. Then, as Simonides looked out once more over the river, he praised his daughter for her wisdom and strength, deeming her ready to hear truths long hidden, truths never shared with the Romans for the sake of hope, and kept even from her so that her heart might grow pure and upright. He began his story with deep solemnity. He had been born in a tomb in the valley of Hinnom, south of Zion. His parents were Hebrew bondservants, tending figs, olives, and vines in the king's garden near Siloam. In his youth, he labored beside them until he was sold to Ben-Hur, who was second only to Herod in wealth. From the garden, Simonides had been transferred to a storehouse in Alexandria, where he worked for 6 years and, by the 7th, under Mosaic law, earned his freedom. Hearing this, Esther lightly clapped her hands in joy, believing her father had never truly been a lifelong servant. But Simonides urged her to listen closely. In those days, temple lawyers debated fiercely over whether children of bondservants were also bound forever. But Ben-Hur, a man of righteousness and deep understanding of the law, declared Simonides a Hebrew servant under purchase, not birth, and with sealed documents still in his possession, formally granted him his freedom. When Esther gently inquired about her mother, Simonides answered with a calm yet weighty tone. He urged her to be patient, promising that before he finished, she would see how impossible it was for him to forget her mother, even more so than forgetting himself. He spoke of the days when his term of service ended, and he traveled to Jerusalem during Passover. Welcomed into his master's home, he felt a deep admiration for the prince, a loyalty that led him to plead for continued service. The prince agreed, and Simonides served another 7 years, this time not as a bondman, but as a hired son of Israel. In those years, he managed the prince's ventures across distant lands, through perilous sea voyages and dangerous caravan routes that stretched east to Susa, Persepolis, and even the silk-rich territories beyond. Through it all, fortune smiled upon his labors. The prince grew wealthier, and Simonides returned not only with great profits, but also with the wisdom that would later carry him through heavier responsibilities. On one particular day, while a guest in his master's Jerusalem house, a servant entered bearing sliced bread. She came to him first, and in that moment, he saw Esther's mother. From that brief encounter, he held her secretly in his heart. Time passed before he finally approached the prince to ask for her hand. Though she was a bondservant for life, the prince was willing to free her should she desire it. She had returned his affection, but declined her freedom, choosing instead to remain where she was. Still, Simonides persisted. He returned again and again over the years, pleading his case. Her answer remained steadfast. She would marry him only if he, too, would embrace servitude forever, as she had done. Drawing inspiration from Jacob's long service for his beloved Rachel, he accepted her condition. He showed Esther the scar upon his ear, the mark left by the awl when he stood before the judges and became a servant for life. Through that act, he won his Rachel, and in his heart, no love could compare to the devotion he bore for her. Their moment of silence spoke of loss, and Esther, moved by the story, kissed her father tenderly. Simonides, in turn, recalled his master's tragic death at sea, the first deep sorrow of his life. It cast mourning not only over the prince's house, but over his own as well. At the time, he lived in Antioch. When the loss occurred, Simonides had already risen to be the prince's chief steward, entrusted with managing every aspect of his vast estate. Such was the depth of trust between them. Determined to fulfill his duty, he hurried to Jerusalem to report to the widow. She retained him as steward, and under his faithful oversight, the estate flourished year after year. Then came the terrible blow, the same one that the young man had recounted. The incident involving Procurator Gratus, which the Romans claimed was an attempted assassination, became the pretext for seizing the fortune of the widow and her children. With imperial approval, Gratus confiscated their immense wealth. To ensure that no reversal could take place, he eliminated all those connected to the estate. From that harrowing day onward, the house of her vanished. The boy, once seen in childhood, was condemned to the galleys. The widow and daughter were believed to be buried alive in Judean dungeons, sealed tombs where names and faces faded from memory, as if swallowed by the sea. No one knew how they died, nor even if they truly had. Esther's eyes welled with tears. Her father looked upon her with warmth, comparing her gentle spirit to that of her mother. He prayed that her kind heart would not suffer the fate so often dealt to the virtuous, crushed by cruelty and blindness. He continued his tale, recounting how he had gone to Jerusalem, determined to help the grieving widow. But at the city gate, he was seized and thrown into the sunken cells of the Tower of Antonia. It was only when Gratus arrived that Simonides learned the reason. The Roman demanded access to the house of hers money, wealth held across the markets of the world, following Jewish custom. Gratus commanded him to transfer the funds. But though the Roman had taken their lands, goods, and ships, Simonides refused to yield the money. He believed, if God remained with him, he could one day restore what had been lost. The Roman tortured him, yet his resolve never wavered. He was eventually released, though broken in body. Returning to Antioch, he began anew, not as steward of the house of Hur, but under his own name, Simonides of Antioch. And through divine favor and relentless work, his fortunes grew. He reminded Esther that she knew how. 3 years later, on his way to Caesarea, Gratus again had him seized. Once more, he was tortured in an effort to force him into surrendering his wealth. And once more, he resisted. Though the pain was unbearable, he returned to find his beloved Rachel dead, taken by fear and grief for him. Despite it all, God had preserved him. He secured from the emperor a license to trade freely throughout the empire. Now, with a voice lifted in humble triumph, he declared that the wealth once held in stewardship had multiplied beyond measure, enough to enrich even a Caesar. With dignity, he raised his head and met Esther's eyes. Without breaking that gaze, he asked what should be done with the treasure. Her answer came softly. Was not the rightful heir already among them? Still, his eyes did not falter, and so she answered again. If she was truly his daughter, then was she not also bound to serve the heir? She recalled the scripture, "Strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come." At her words, a light of boundless love touched his face, and with great tenderness, he whispered that of all the blessings God had given him, none surpassed the gift of Esther, his most perfect favor. He drew Esther close to his chest and kissed her with tender affection again and again. Then, with a clearer, more resolute voice, he began to explain the reason for his laughter that morning. As he looked upon the young man, it was as if the image of his master in youthful form had returned. His spirit, stirred by recognition, rose instinctively to honor the vision. In that instant, he believed his days of trial were over, his labor complete. He could barely restrain himself from crying out, from taking the young man's hand and revealing the carefully guarded wealth he had accumulated. All prepared, all waiting. In his heart, he was ready to offer it fully, proclaiming his continued servitude and asking only for release from his earthly duties. Yet, just as he was about to speak, 3 thoughts surged forth and held him back. First, he told himself he must be certain. The young man must truly be the prince's son. Second, if the young man was indeed the rightful heir, he needed to understand his nature. Many have been born into riches only to turn them into vessels of ruin. With tightened hands and a voice sharpened by bitter memory, he recalled the agonies inflicted upon him by the Romans, not just by Gratus, but by all the pitiless men who carried out his orders. They had laughed as he screamed under torture. He asked Esther to consider his broken frame, the years spent stooped and diminished, to think of her mother, buried and broken in soul, crushed by sorrow. He urged her to remember the suffering of her family, if they still lived, and the inhuman fate they met if they had perished. In light of all this pain, he questioned whether even a single drop of blood shed in retribution would not be just. He dismissed the teachings of preachers who claimed vengeance belonged only to the Lord. Was it not true, he asked, that God often enacted his will, whether in love or in judgment, through human agents? Did he not have warriors more numerous than prophets? Was not the old law clear? An eye for an eye, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot. Through the long years, Simonides had dreamed of vengeance. He had prayed for it, prepared for it, and seen his wealth as a means to purchase justice against the wrongdoers. And when the young man had spoken of his skill with weapons, though vague in purpose, Simonides needed no further hint. He had named that purpose in his own heart. Vengeance. That word alone had been the third and final thought which held him back, made him silent in the face of the young man's pleading, and had caused him to laugh after the visitor departed. Esther gently caressed her father's worn and faded hands. Her heart, racing alongside his thoughts, wondered aloud whether the young man would return. Simonides assured her he would, for Malak, ever faithful, had gone with him and would bring him back at the right time. And that time would not be long in coming. The young man believed all his witnesses were lost, but there remained one who would recognize him without fail, if he truly was the son of the master. When Esther softly guessed it might be his mother, Simonides answered no. He would present the witness himself, but until that moment arrived, they would leave the matter in the hands of the Lord. He confessed that he was weary and asked her to call Abimelech. Esther did as he requested, summoning the servant, and together they returned quietly into the house. As Ben-Hur stepped out from the vast warehouse, a heavy weight of disappointment settled upon him. Once again, he had failed in his search for his loved ones. The more precious the people were to him, the deeper the ache of this repeated defeat. A dense sense of loneliness wrapped around him, leaving him with an emptiness so profound that life itself seemed to lose its meaning. He made his way through the crowds and the stacked goods until he reached the river's edge. There, the shaded depths of the water tempted him with a strange calm. The lazy current appeared to slow down, as if waiting for him. But suddenly, a memory came back, the words of a traveler, claiming it better to live as a simple worm feeding on the mulberries of Daphne than to be a guest at a king's table. Shaking off the spell, he turned abruptly and walked with purpose back toward the khan. He asked the steward for directions to Daphne. The man was surprised at the question and responded with delight, calling it the happiest day of Ben-Hur's life. The road, the steward assured, would be easy to follow. Southward from the next street, one would ascend Mount Sulpius, its summit marked by the altar of Jupiter and an amphitheater. From there, the traveler should follow Herod's colonnade, take a right at the third cross street, and move through the old city of Seleucus until arriving at the bronze gates of Epiphanes. Beyond those gates began the road to Daphne. With those instructions and a few details regarding his baggage, Ben-Hur set out. Herod's colonnade was easy to find. From there, he continued under a long marble portico, passing through crowds that reflected the diversity of the world's trading nations. By the 4th hour of the day, he had exited the city's limits and found himself among a seemingly endless procession headed to the sacred Grove of Daphne. The road ahead was well organized, with different paths for foot travelers, horseback riders, and chariots. Each route had separate lanes for those coming and going. Low balustrades marked the divisions, occasionally broken by tall pedestals topped with statues. On both sides of the road, neatly trimmed grass stretched wide, shaded here and there by clusters of oak and sycamore trees. Vine-covered summer houses offered rest to the weary, especially those returning from the grove. The pedestrian paths were paved with red stone, while the roads for riders were coated with finely rolled white sand, soft enough to muffle the sounds of hooves and wheels. The fountains along the way were countless, each more magnificent than the last, gifts from foreign kings, each bearing the donor's name. The road extended over 4 miles southwest, all the way to the gates of the grove. But Ben-Hur, lost in sorrow, paid little attention to the grand design of the road or to the people surrounding him. His heart was too heavy to admire the beauty. He regarded the whole pageant with indifference. A Roman at heart, he still held a quiet arrogance, believing no provincial ceremony could match the grandeur of Rome. So, rather than lingering, he used every opportunity to move ahead of the slow-moving crowds. Eventually, he reached the village of Heraclea, situated between the city and the grove. By then, physical fatigue softened his mood, making him more open to the sights around him. A woman, radiant and adorned with flowers, led a pair of equally decorated goats. She caught his attention. Soon after, a great white bull passed by, its back draped in fresh vines. Atop it sat a naked child in a basket, like a tiny Bacchus, pressing berries in a juice and drinking with ritual grace. Ben-Hur paused, wondering which deity's altar would receive such a lavish offering. Then came a horse, its mane trimmed in the style of the time, its rider dressed with regal splendor. Ben-Hur noticed the matching pride in both man and beast. As more chariots rolled past, he found himself drawn to their designs and drivers. He began to study the people more closely, men and women of all ages, every one of them dressed in festive attire. Some groups were all white, others in black. Some carried flags, others waved incense burners. Many walked slowly, singing sacred hymns, while others marched to the beat of flutes and tabrets. If this was how people traveled to Daphne on an ordinary day, he thought, then the grove itself must be an extraordinary sight. At last, a wave of joyous cries and clapping swept through the crowd. All eyes turned toward the hilltop. There, in the distance, the gate of the grove appeared, crowned with temples. The hymns rose louder, the music quickened, and carried by the crowd's excitement, Ben-Hur too was swept forward. Though raised in Roman customs, even he could not help but stand in reverence, awed by the splendor of the place before him. Behind the grand structure that marked the entrance, crafted purely in Grecian style, Ben-Hur found himself upon a wide esplanade paved with polished stone. Around him surged a lively, colorful crowd, their exclamations echoing amid the shimmer of crystal white spray leaping from nearby fountains. Before him, toward the southwest, dustless paths fanned out into a lush garden, and beyond that, a shadowy forest draped in pale blue mist. Ben-Hur stood uncertain, his eyes wandering, unsure where to begin in this strange, enchanting place. Just then, he overheard a woman nearby marveling aloud at the beauty of the scene, though unsure of which way to go. Her companion, adorned with a chaplet of bay leaves, laughed and dismissed her concerns with poetic charm, speaking of winds that carried the breath of gods. He insisted that fears were left behind in Antioch, as if Daphne itself existed beyond the reach of mortal concerns. Though she worried they might get lost, he assured her only those who chose to remain forever were truly lost here. To illustrate, he gestured toward a sudden commotion, where a group of girls, their sandals barely touching the marble, danced in a view with joyful rhythm. Their sheer garments shimmered as they played their tabrets, their bodies lithe and free in a dance too delicate and sensual for words. The woman, startled, leaned into her companion, who joyfully joined the rhythm, his hand lifted to the music. In a moment, the dancers vanished into the crowd as swiftly as they had come. The man explained that they were priestesses of Apollo, part of a great chorus who called Daphne their home. Sometimes they traveled, but their offerings always returned to enrich the temple of the divine musician. Soon after, the couple disappeared into the garden paths, leaving Ben-Hur more intrigued than ever. Comforted by the thought that no one was truly lost in Daphne, he too began to wander. The first thing to draw him was a statue on an elegant pedestal. It was a centaur, Chiron, beloved of Apollo and Diana, master of hunting, healing, music, and prophecy. A carved inscription told visitors to look to a particular corner of the sky on a clear night, where the centaur would appear among the stars, placed there by Jupiter himself, a symbol of eternal wisdom. In the statue's hand was a scroll with a message engraved in Greek. It welcomed travelers and offered gentle counsel. to delight in the sound of brooks, to revere the breezes of Daphne, and to beware of harsh winds as signs of divine displeasure. It warned against disturbing the sacred shades of the grove at night, and urged moderation in eating the lotus by the streams, lest memory fade away. There were reminders to respect the weaving spider as the servant of Minerva, and a final solemn note. Breaking a laurel bud meant beholding Daphne's tears and dying. The scroll's closing words invited the traveler to listen, stay, and be happy. Ben-Hur left the interpretation of the mystic procession to those around him, and turned away just as the white bull was led past. The boy sat calmly in the wicker basket, followed by a solemn procession. Behind them came the woman guiding her goats, and further along, the flute and tabret players trailed another group bearing gifts. The crowd murmured with speculation, some guessing the bull was bound for Father Jove, others recalling how Apollo once tended the flocks of Admetus, and thus concluding the goat was meant for Apollo. In moments like this, a gentle request is made for the reader's patience. Exposure to unfamiliar beliefs often nurtures a kind of spiritual flexibility. Over time, one learns to see goodness reflected in many creeds, realizing that respecting another's faith can be an extension of respecting the person who holds it. Ben-Hur had reached this understanding. Despite his years in Rome and his brutal time as a galley slave, his identity as a Jew remained intact. Yet he no longer viewed it as impious to appreciate beauty, even in the sacred Grove of Daphne. Even if his religious caution had remained strict, his mood today would have overpowered it. His anger was not born from petty irritations, nor was it fleeting like the foolish tempers that vanish with a sigh or curse. This was a deeper, more consuming fury, one rooted in the violent shattering of hope. He had carried dreams that promised great happiness, and their collapse had left him not just hurt, but outraged. And now, his quarrel was not with any person, but with fate itself. One might reflect further. How much easier life would be if fate were something solid, something that could be confronted or struck, if it had a voice to argue with or a face to curse. Perhaps then a heart so deeply wounded would not have to turn inward and punish itself. Ordinarily, Ben-Hur would never have wandered into the grove alone. He would have used his status in the consul's household to prepare properly, either by hiring a guide or presenting a letter of introduction to the master of the place. That would have made him a dignified visitor, like the eager crowds around him. But today was different. He had no reverence for the gods honored here, nor any curiosity to explore. He moved through the grove in the blindness of bitter disappointment, not waiting for fate to find him, but boldly searching for it, as if to challenge it directly. Most have known this state of mind at some point, even if not as intensely. It's the strange clarity in which people perform brave or reckless acts with calm expressions. And if the reader is fortunate, they will hope for Ben-Hur's sake that the folly now pulling him forward is merely a harmless jest, and not a merciless danger with steel in its hand. Ben-Hur walked into the forest with the procession, though his heart remained distant. At first, he didn't even care to know their destination. Still, just enough curiosity flickered in him to assume they were headed to the temples, the grove's central marvels, revered for their allure. As melodies floated through the air like drifting dreams, a strange thought repeated itself in his mind, that perhaps it was better to be a mere worm feeding on Daphne's mulberries than to sit as a guest of kings. The repetition gave rise to troubling questions. Could life in the grove truly be that sweet? What was its secret? Was it hidden in some quiet philosophy? Or was it something simple, something seen and felt with the eyes and senses of any ordinary soul? Every year, countless people abandon the world to devote themselves here. Did they find what they were seeking? And if they did, was it powerful enough to make them forget all the joys and pains that make up a life, the hopeful dreams of tomorrow and the lingering sorrows of yesterday? If the grove could do that for them, why not for him? Could its blessings reach everyone but the children of Abraham? With a restless mind, he began to search for answers, ignoring the cheerful music and the lively company surrounding him. He looked skyward for meaning, but the sky offered him nothing. It was just a beautiful blue, filled with fluttering swallows, no different than the one above the city. Soon, a gentle breeze swept across the path from the woods, bathing him in a wave of perfume, a blend of roses and rich spices. He paused, as did others, turning toward the fragrant wind. It hinted at some ritual deep within, perhaps a ceremony in honor of Diana or Pan or another woodland deity. Nearby, a man spoke. The familiar cadence of his mother tongue caught Ben-Hur off guard. The stranger had the face of a Judean and the simple garments of a pilgrim, brown cloth with a yellow rope and a staff in hand. He left a strong impression, but before Ben-Hur could speak further, the crowd surged ahead, separating them. The image of that man stayed with him, honest, quiet, and deeply familiar. At that point along the path, a trail led away into the trees. It offered escape from the noise and bustle. Ben-Hur followed it. At first glance, the thicket seemed wild, like untouched nature, a place for nesting birds. But a few steps in, he recognized the careful design. The bushes bore fruit or blooms. The branches drooped over beds of color, and delicate jasmine vines laced through them. The air was sweet with the breath of roses, lilies, lilacs, tulips, and oleander, fragrances he knew well from gardens near Jerusalem. And there, winding gently through the shadows lit by blossoms, a brook made its quiet journey. Around him, birds called from both sides, the coo of doves, the cry of pigeons. A nightingale, undisturbed, remained close as he passed. A blackbird watched from nearby. A quail darted across his path, leading her chicks with a gentle whistle. As he stopped for them, a figure emerged from the flowering musk, startling him. For a moment, it felt as if he had stumbled upon a satyr in its secret home. But then he noticed the curved, pruning knife between the man's teeth. The scene made him smile, and just like that, the mystery of the grove became clear. This was peace, not just the absence of fear, but peace as the very essence of life. He sat beneath a citron tree, its gray roots curling toward the brook. Beside him, a tiny nest hung close to the bubbling stream. A small bird looked out and met his gaze. In that quiet exchange, something stirred in him. The bird, he imagined, was offering a message that here love ruled over all, and in that love, fear had no place. The grove had revealed its charm. He felt joy returning and thought perhaps he could lose himself here as others had, caring for the plants, tending the growth of all things silent and beautiful. Couldn't he, like the man with the pruning knife, let go of his wounded past? Couldn't he fade away, forgotten and forgetting? But his Jewish soul soon stirred. Maybe the grove was enough for some. But who were they? What kind of people chose this life? Love was indeed sweet, especially after the pain he had known. But could it be the whole of life? Was that all? There was something different about him. Those who gave themselves fully to this place, they must have had no duties left behind. But he cannot say the same. Suddenly, his emotions surged. Shame and sorrow crashed over him. He jumped to his feet, cheeks burning with grief. His soul cried out, not just in protest, but in remembrance. He could not find happiness while his mother and Tirzah remained lost, and no charm of grove or garden could wash away that sacred responsibility. He moved swiftly through the thicket until he reached a broad stream, flowing with the force of a river between stone-built banks, broken at intervals by sluice gates. A bridge carried his path across the water, and as he paused upon it, his gaze fell upon other bridges down the stream, each one different in shape and style. Beneath him, the water lay still in a deep, shadowed pool. Further along, it crashed over rocks with a thunderous roar, then settled into another pool, followed by yet another cascade. The rhythm repeated into the distance. In these pools and bridges and tumbling waters, It was easy to sense that the river was governed by design, guided by master hand, tamed into obedient flow as if honoring the will of the gods. Beyond the bridge stretched a landscape of open valleys and scattered elevations, where groves and glittering lakes met houses adorned with artful charm. Everything was connected by shining streams and white, winding paths. The valleys, green and lush, had been laid low so the river could spill across them during dry days. They were like giant carpets woven with flower beds and soft fields, dotted with flocks of sheep as white as snowballs. Far off, shepherds could be heard calling to their herds. Scattered across this sacred terrain stood countless open-air altars, each attended by a figure in white robes. Processions, also in white, moved slowly between them, and faint clouds of smoke hung above, hovering over the places of offering like silent prayers. His attention wandered freely, captivated by the harmony of everything he saw, now resting in the meadows, now climbing the hills, now drawn to the hidden paths weaving through groves and vanishing into distant mystery. The whole scene whispered a singular promise: peace. It floated in the air and rested on the land, inviting all who beheld it to lay down their burdens and find rest here. Then a truth struck him with sudden clarity. This grove was no mere sanctuary. It was a temple, vast and without walls. Nothing he had ever seen compared. The one who shaped it had not been concerned with columns or facades, nor with architectural boundaries. Instead, nature itself had been called into service, transformed by a master of design. Art could go no further. It was as though the ancient spirit of Arcadia had come alive again, and like the old myths, the genius behind it all was unmistakably Greek. Crossing the bridge, he entered the closest valley. There, he passed a flock of sheep tended by a young girl who motioned to him as though to summon him forward. A little farther along, the path split around an altar, its base made of black gneiss, topped with white marble carved in elegant leafwork, and crowned with a bronze brazier burning with fire. Beside it stood a woman who noticed him and raised a wand of willow in silent invitation, her smile alive with youthful temptation. Still he moved on, meeting a procession along the way. It began with little girls adorned only in garlands, their high voices lifting in song. Following them came sun-darkened boys, also unclothed, dancing to the girls' music. Behind them trailed a line of women carrying baskets filled with fragrant spices and sweets meant for the altars. They wore simple robes, untroubled by exposure. As he passed, they extended their hands toward him in gesture, urging him to join them. One of them, a Greek, sang softly, a lyric about seizing the present, not knowing what tomorrow might bring. Yet Ben-Hur walked on, unmoved. He came finally to a lush grove nestled in the valley's heart, perfectly positioned to draw the eye. Its shade lured him, and through its branches, the glimmer of what looked like a grand statue beckoned. Unable to resist, he stepped away from the path and entered the cool, secluded haven. The grass beneath his feet felt fresh and pure, untouched by dust or disorder. The trees around him did not grow in a crowd, but stood apart in harmonious design, each a native of the East, yet many adopted from faraway lands. They formed gentle clusters, palm trees, their plumes high like crowned queens, sycamores rising above dark-leaf laurels, evergreen oaks and towering cedars that could have ruled the forests of Lebanon, and mulberries and terebinths so radiant. They seemed more like gifts from Eden's orchard than anything born of soil. At the center of this serene beauty stood a statue, Daphne, breathtaking in her craftsmanship. Yet he had barely more than a glimpse of her sculpted face when his gaze was pulled downward. At the foot of the pedestal, a young man and a girl lay asleep in each other's embrace, stretched across a tiger's skin. Their tools, his axe and sickle, her basket, had been tossed carelessly beside a heap of withering roses, abandoned without thought. The sight unsettled him. Moments earlier, in the quiet of the scented thicket, He had nearly surrendered to the idea that the grove offered peace without fear. But now, here in the clear light of day, in the shadow of Daphne herself, he saw another truth, a deeper chapter not easily spoken aloud. The law of this place was love, but it was a love without boundaries, without any guiding law. And this, then, was the peace of Daphne. This was the final purpose for those who serve her. For this, kings and princes offered up their treasures. For this, a clever priesthood bent all of nature to its will. Its birds, its brooks, its blossoms, the river's course, the labor of countless hands, the altars once thought sacred, and even the power of the sun. It would be comforting to say that, as Ben-Hur continued his walk lost in such thoughts, he felt sorrow for the worshippers of this open-air sanctuary, especially for those who gave their lives maintaining its exquisite beauty. Their path, once mysterious, now appeared clear. The lure, the motivation, the promise that drew them and stood plain before him. Some among them were likely drawn by the hope of peace, a haven for the weary soul. If they had no wealth, they could offer labor and become part of the grove's living splendor. These souls might have been guided by a mind acutely vulnerable to hope and fear. But such seekers were rare. The vast majority belonged to a different class altogether. The traps of Apollo were many, and their reach wide, and it is less that their victims cannot be described than that they should not be. The truth, however difficult, demanded honesty. Most were Sybarites of the world, the indulgent, the pleasure seekers, the many whose lives revolved around sensual desires. In the East, this was nearly universal. They did not come to honor the singing God or his doomed beloved. They did not seek wisdom or the solace of faith. Their loyalty was not to love in its sacred form. Rather, they gave themselves over to sensation with no higher purpose. And if truth must be told, there were but two peoples on earth in that age capable of deeper spiritual longing: those who lived under the law of Moses and those who followed the teachings of Brahma. Only they could have declared that a life governed by law, even without love, was far better than love that knew no law at all. Yet, sympathy, like most emotions, depends greatly on one's state of mind. Anger makes it impossible, while self-contentment opens the heart to it easily. Ben-Hur walked now with quicker steps, head held higher. Though still stirred by the beauty surrounding him, he viewed it with a more composed spirit and, at times, with a faint curl of the lip. He had nearly been deceived himself, and that thought would not easily fade. Before Ben-Hur stretched a solemn forest of cypress trees, tall and upright like silent sentinels, each one straight as a mast. As he stepped into the shaded stillness, a lively trumpet call rang through the air. Moments later, he noticed a familiar figure lying on the grass, the same countryman he had encountered earlier on the road. The man stood and approached him warmly. After a brief exchange, Ben-Hur learned that the man was heading toward the stadium. Curious, he admitted his unfamiliarity with the grove and humbly asked to accompany him. The man, introducing himself as Malik, a merchant from Antioch, was delighted by the request. As distant wheels rolled over the track, Malik mentioned the chariots had begun taking their positions. In turn, Ben-Hur introduced himself as the adopted son of Arius, the Roman duumvir, though now clad in the attire of his Jewish heritage. Their conversation, simple yet sincere, set a tone of quiet anticipation. Together, they passed through the cypress belt and arrived at an open field with a stadium track, soft and well-kept, bordered on both sides by ropes held up on javelins. Wooden stands shaded by sturdy awnings offered seats that rose row upon row. The two men found a spot among the spectators. As 9 chariots passed, Ben-Hur admired their form and ambition, especially impressed by the boldness of racing in fours, something rare in the East. The last chariot, coming at full gallop, immediately caught his attention. Its beauty and strength reminded him even of the imperial stables of Rome, yet what followed broke the harmony. The horses suddenly grew unruly. Amid the commotion, Ben-Hur noticed an elderly man, visibly agitated, half rising from a high seat. His clenched fists, burning eyes, and trembling white beard drew laughter from the nearby onlookers. That man, he learned, was Sheikh Ilderim, a powerful figure from the desert, famed for his camels and horses, which were believed to descend from Pharaoh's racers. The Sheikh's agitation only grew as the driver struggled to calm the steeds. Frustration poured from him, his shouts filled with fury and heartbreak. It was not just about pride or competition. Ben-Hur sensed something deeper. There was a reverence, even love, for those animals, as if they were more than property, almost sacred to him. And truly, they were remarkable. The four bays stood flawless and radiant, their symmetry so perfect to disguise their actual size. Slender ears framed small noble heads, their broad faces lit with fire-red nostrils. Their arched necks bore thick, silken manes that spilled over their shoulders. Forelocks streamed like unraveling veils, and strong, well-muscled legs supported their sculpted bodies. Their hooves gleamed like polished stone. As they reared and pounded the ground, their long black tails lashed the air with wild energy. Indeed, they were worthy of the Sheikh's devotion, and of the name he gave them, the priceless. As Ben-Hur continued observing the horses, he began to see something deeper, an unspoken story binding them to their master. These were no ordinary animals. They had grown beneath the Sheikh's loving gaze, cherished during the heat of day, and even more deeply honored in his dreams at night. Back in the black tents of the desert, where shade was a luxury, these creatures had been like family, nurtured with the same tenderness one might offer beloved children. The Sheikh had brought them here not merely to race, but to claim victory over the proud and despised Romans. His trust in their strength was unwavering. He believed they could win, if only the right driver, one with both skill and a matching spirit, could guide them. But unlike the more reserved customs of the West, the Sheikh's nature would not allow him to quietly dismiss the driver's failure. As a man of the East, an Arab and a tribal patriarch, he reacted with fiery outbursts, his voice breaking through the air like thunder. Before his passionate tirade had run its course, hands reached for the horses' bridles, and calm slowly returned. Just then, a new chariot made its entrance onto the track, its driver, vehicle, and team exactly as they would appear in the grand arena on the day of competition. Unlike the earlier arrivals, this one drew immediate attention. Spectators burst into applause and cheers, focusing entirely on the approaching contender. The contrast was striking. The pair of yoke steeds were deep black, while the tracemates beside them gleamed white as snow. Yet, despite the spectacle, there was something unsettling. Each horse had been cropped and groomed to match Roman standards, their tails clipped, manes cut short and tied into bright red and yellow knots, markings of unnecessary cruelty masked as tradition. As the chariot moved closer, the craftsmanship became evident. Bronze bands reinforced delicate hubs. Ivory spokes arched outward in elegant dishing. Ebony rims were fastened by shining bronze tires, and the axle bore brass carvings of snarling tigers. The body itself was formed from willow wands, glimmering under layers of gold. The stunning display pulled Ben-Hur's gaze toward the driver, awakening a buried memory. Though the man's face was still concealed, something in his posture, a familiar arrogance, triggered a surge of recognition. With each step the chariot took, the feeling grew stronger. The rider stood tall, the reins wrapped tightly around his waist, his red tunic revealing a proud frame. A whip in one hand, and in the other his arm poised to command. He wore the cold indifference of a man used to admiration. Cheers echoed around him, but he remained unmoved. Ben-Hur stepped forward, pushing closer to the edge of the viewing stand, his heart quickening. And when the driver finally came fully into view, the truth hit like a storm. There was no mistaking the man. The stance, the boldness, the chiseled features carved from centuries of imperial pride. Ben-Hur knew him. The driver was Messala, From the horses and the gilded chariot to the icy arrogance in his eyes, Messala stood unchanged, just as ruthless, just as confident, just as ready to conquer. As Ben-Hur descended from the viewing stand, an Arab suddenly appeared at the bottom step, proclaiming to the gathered crowd an open challenge from the noble Sheikh Ilderim. The Sheikh, having brought with him 4 majestic steeds, descendants of Solomon's treasured horses, sought a worthy driver bold enough to command them. A reward of lasting enrichment was promised to any man who could satisfy the Sheikh's expectations. This offer, announced beneath the awnings, quickly stirred a wave of excitement, and by nightfall, it was destined to echo through every circle of sport and strength in Antioch. Hearing the proclamation, Ben-Hur paused briefly, his eyes shifting from the herald to the Sheikh with uncertain thought. Malik, nearby, suspected he might accept the offer, but was quietly relieved when Ben-Hur instead turned to him and asked their next destination. With a light-hearted tone, Malik suggested they follow the local custom and visit the fortune-tellers of the grove. The mention of fortune amused Ben-Hur, though only faintly, and he agreed to go. Yet the Apollonian practice, as Malik described, required no mystical priestess or sibyl, but merely the purchase of a fresh papyrus leaf. Dipping the leaf into the sacred fountain known as Castalia would cause a hidden verse to emerge, supposedly revealing one's future. The momentary spark of interest faded from Ben-Hur's face, replaced by gloom. For those like him, burdened with dark memories and heavier hopes, such amusements meant little. The temples, though Greek in design, held no allure either. Ben-Hur found their symmetry beautiful yet monotonous. Still, the fame of the Castalia fountain drew them on. As they walked, Malik noted the shift in his companion's mood. Ben-Hur seemed distant, lost in silent thought, indifferent to the bustling crowd and the beauty around them. In truth, the unexpected sighting of Messala had plunged Ben-Hur deep into reflection. He recalled, with painful clarity, how swiftly his life had unraveled, how the Roman had betrayed him, sealed the gates of his family's home, and left him in the misery of the galleys. In that darkness, vengeance had become his only vision. Gratus might be forgiven, perhaps, but never Messala. Again and again, he would replay the moment of betrayal, the pleas he made not for himself, but for his mother, and the cruel laughter that followed. Now, that long-imagined confrontation was no longer a fantasy, and seeing Messala thriving, adorned in splendor, only sharpened the ache. What Malik mistook as a momentary loss of spirit was, in truth, a growing storm within, a quiet preparation for the moment that was surely coming. Soon, the path curved into an avenue of towering oaks where groups of people passed, some walking, some in litters, others on horseback or chariots that thundered by. The road gently dipped into a verdant lowland. On one side, gray stone cliffs stood tall, while the other opened into a sunlit meadow. At the heart of this peaceful clearing flowed the renowned fountain of Castalia. A crystal stream leapt from stone into a black marble basin, its waters bubbling and swirling before vanishing into a hidden drain. By the basin sat an ancient priest, shrouded and still, a silent fixture beneath a carved stone portico. He watched all, yet spoke to none. Occasionally, a visitor would place a coin in his hand, receiving in return a single papyrus leaf. The ritual was always the same: dip the leaf, hold it to the sun, and read the verse revealed by the sacred water. Its words were rarely profound, but the magic of the moment endured. Just as Ben-Hur prepared to participate, the murmurs of the crowd shifted. Eyes turned toward the meadow where a white camel approached, tall, elegant, and draped in crimson and gold. It was led by a mounted attendant and followed by guards carrying long spears. The sight drew speculation. Some guessed a prince, others a king. But one observer, more discerning, noted the camel's rarity and concluded that the passengers, barely visible under the ornate howdah, were women. The camel's beauty was unmatched, its soft steps marked by silver bells, its movements graceful as if it bore no weight at all. As it drew near, all curiosity turned to the figures inside. One of them, clearly aged, sat beneath an enormous turban, his face so withered that his origin remained a mystery. Time, it seemed, spared no rank, not even royalty. And of all his possessions, the only item to stir envy was the rich shawl that wrapped around him. Seated in the manner of Eastern nobility, the woman was enveloped in a delicate cascade of veils and fine laces. Adornments wrapped her arms, armlets shaped like coiled serpents that connected to golden bracelets by thin chains. Her arms, otherwise bare, bore a natural elegance, and her hands, small and childlike, rested gracefully on the edge of the carriage. The fingers shimmered with rings, their tips blushed with a soft pink tint, like mother-of-pearl kissed by light. Upon her head, she wore a jeweled mesh of coral beads and sunlit coins, some draped across her forehead, others cascading through the strands of her straight, deep black hair. Though veiled, the hair itself shimmered like a treasured possession, requiring no ornament beyond its own beauty. From her high perch, she observed the passing crowd with calm curiosity, seemingly unaware of the stir her presence caused. Unlike most women of rank, she did not conceal her face, presenting it openly in gentle defiance of custom. The face was a vision, youthful, oval in shape, and radiant with a complexion untouched by typical distinctions. Neither the fair tone of the Greek, nor the bronze of the Roman, nor the golden hue of the Gaul. It was something more rare, as if the sun of the Upper Nile had softly touched translucent skin, allowing warm blood to glow through cheeks and brow like lamplight through alabaster. Her eyes, large and expressive, were accentuated with the dark kohl familiar throughout the East. Her lips, softly parted, revealed perfect teeth gleaming beneath their natural tint. The poise of her head, small and classically shaped, rested on a long, graceful neck, giving her an air so refined and regal that the word queenly barely captured its full dignity. Satisfied with her quiet study of the scene, she softly motioned to her Ethiopian driver, a towering figure of great strength, bare-chested and silent, who brought the camel forward toward the fountain. As the animal knelt, she passed him a cup to be filled. But just then, a thunder of hooves shattered the quiet, and the crowd scattered in alarm. A chariot raced toward them, reckless and fast, bearing down with dangerous momentum. It was Messala, driving directly through the gathered people, forcing them to leap aside in panic. The camel, elegant and at rest, seemed unaware of the looming danger. The old man in the carriage stirred, but age hindered his movement. The woman, trapped by surprise, could do nothing. Ben-Hur stood closest. Recognizing the imminent peril, he sprang forward, not hesitating, grasping the bridles of the chariot's left side steeds. His voice and body worked together in one desperate motion, pulling the horses aside just in time. The sudden shift reared the team, tilted the chariot, and sent Messala's charioteer sprawling to the ground. Laughter burst from the crowd, their tension released. Messala, bold as ever, dismounted with a theatrical flourish. He circled the camel and casually addressed the travelers, offering apology in a tone of careless charm. With arrogant ease, he turned to the woman with flattery on his lips and mock reverence in his gestures, attempting to win a moment of her attention. But she offered him no reply. Instead, turning with quiet grace, she spoke to Ben-Hur, requesting his help to fetch water for her father. The young man obeyed, humbled by the gesture and the honor of her trust. As he turned, his eyes met Messala's, one gaze firm and challenging, the other amused and confident. Their unspoken rivalry burned in that single moment. As the Roman took his leave, the woman watched him without anger, her gaze composed and unreadable. She then raised the cup to her lips and, in a gesture both gentle and noble, handed it to Ben-Hur with a blessing and a soft invitation to keep it. As the camel prepared to rise, the old man, moved by the rescue and the kindness shown, called Ben-Hur forward. In a voice filled with dignity and warmth, he revealed his name, Balthasar, the Egyptian, and offered heartfelt thanks in the name of the one true God. He extended an invitation to visit their tents, nestled in the shade of palms in the orchard beyond Daphne, where Sheikh Ilderim, known for his hospitality, would welcome him with honor. Ben-Hur stood in quiet awe, the words of the elder lingering in his heart, even as Messala vanished into the distance, laughing as if untouched by the weight of anything that had passed. As a general truth, behaving with integrity in the face of others' misdeeds often leads to resentment. Yet in this moment, Malak proved an exception. What he had just witnessed stirred admiration in him. Ben-Hur had revealed courage and skill that could not be denied. Now, if only Malak could gain insight into the young man's past, the day's events would carry more than just momentary meaning. They might prove of real value to Simonides. All that he had learned so far narrowed down to two simple facts. The subject of his inquiry was a Jew and the adopted son of a distinguished Roman. Still, Malak's perceptive mind was beginning to sense something more, a mysterious connection between this Jew and Messala, son of the Duumvir. What the nature of that connection was, he couldn't say. No clear solution presented itself, until fate gave him help directly. Ben-Hur, appearing thoughtful and intense, led Malak away from the dispersing crowd and surprised him with a sudden question, one that spoke of pain, of family, and of deep personal loss. Malak, though initially uncertain, responded with heartfelt conviction, affirming an unbreakable bond to one's mother, especially for a true son of Israel. Ben-Hur's expression deepened with emotion, and as memory surged, he shared his story of a father once honored in Jerusalem, of a mother who was both kind and graceful, of a happy home shattered in an instant by Roman violence. The tragedy unfolded swiftly: a Roman official, an accident, a gate broken, and a family torn apart. From that day forward, he had lived without knowledge of his mother or sister's fate. But he recognized the man who stood that day, one who had laughed as his mother pleaded for her children, one who now held the secret that haunted him. Malak listened, moved not just by the sorrow in Ben-Hur's words, but by his restraint. This was no man driven blindly by revenge. He sought justice with purpose. The listener, once a messenger serving another, now felt bound to Ben-Hur himself, driven by genuine respect. As they walked across the meadow, Ben-Hur confided in him a plan, not one of violence, but of justice, with Malak as an ally. They sealed the agreement with a handshake, and with renewed resolve, Ben-Hur turned their steps toward a new purpose. In the quiet that followed, he asked of a man named Sheikh Ilderim in the orchard of palms near Daphne. Though Malak momentarily wondered if the thought of love might be displacing the sorrow of a lost mother, he answered plainly, and also confirmed the upcoming games, wonders yet to unfold on a path now shared between the two. The line of questioning stirred Malak's mind. If not restoring complete confidence, it certainly piqued his curiosity. He explained that the upcoming celebration would be nothing short of magnificent. The prefect, wealthy in his own right, was known for his lavish spending, especially when under pressure to impress those in higher places. With the consul Maxentius soon to arrive in Antioch for preparations against the Parthians, the prefect was compelled to outdo himself. The entire city, seasoned in the art of profiting from such grand occasions, had joined him in honoring the consul. Heralds had already gone forth, declaring the circus games open. The promise of splendor, backed by Antioch's participation, had drawn professionals from distant islands and coastal cities. With royal fees offered, the spectacle would be unparalleled. The circus of Antioch itself, though slightly smaller than Rome's Maximus, boasted similar design and grandeur, with one unique distinction. There, unlike in Rome, all chariots began the race regardless of number, a rule inspired by Greek traditions. This freedom excited Ben-Hur, who learned that he could select both his own chariot and horses. As the conversation deepened, satisfaction began to replace thoughtfulness on his face. When he asked about the date, Malik counted aloud, confirming that the games were to take place 6 days hence. The time frame was tight, but Ben-Hur responded with confidence, vowing to take the reins once more. His past victories in Rome, though unspoken to many, had been decisive, so much so that even the emperor had offered him patronage. Yet, as a Jew, he had refused to tarnish his family's honor by competing under Roman banners. He had practiced in private, but never for prizes. And even now, the prospect of a rich reward held no appeal. His true goal was to bring down his enemy in the most public way possible. Vengeance, after all, was permitted by law. Malik, understanding the sentiment deeply, confirmed that Messala was committed to the race, not only through public announcements, but also through wagers that filled the tablets of Antioch's young elites. Every day, he trained openly, proudly, and visibly. Ben-Hur, recognizing both the chariot and the horses, expressed satisfaction and eagerness to act. He insisted that they travel immediately to the Orchard of Palms and meet Sheikh Ilderim before his prized steeds were committed elsewhere. Though Malik briefly wondered if some romantic interest had sparked Ben-Hur's urgency, the latter dismissed all such notions with sharp clarity. He had seen the horses only briefly, but their pedigree was unmistakable, glorious beasts of desert blood, rivaled only by those in Caesar's own stables. Just as he could recognize a friend from a fleeting glance, so too could he know those horses again by face, form, and bearing. If their nature could be brought under his control, he was certain of success, not for gold or fame, but for the honor of his house and the justice owed to him. At last, realizing time was precious, the two decided on the quickest path to the Sheikh's tents. Malik led the way toward a nearby village of palatial gardens and princely inns, where they managed to hire swift dromedaries and set off on the road to the legendary Orchard of Palms. Beyond the village, the land unfolded in soft undulations, richly cultivated as the flourishing garden belt of Antioch. Not a single foot lay untouched by the hand of labor. The terraced slopes bore orderly rows of greenery, while vines climbed along bright hedges, casting cool shade and offering hints of wine yet to come. Clusters of purple grapes hung heavy with ripeness. Whitewashed farmhouses peeked from orchards thick with melons, apricots, figs, oranges, and limes. Everywhere, signs of prosperity abounded, evidence that plenty, the smiling daughter of peace, dwelled there. Her quiet joy stirred warmth even in the heart of a traveler hardened by Rome, leaving one momentarily inclined to give the empire its due. From time to time, glimpses of the distant Taurus and Lebanon rose into view, with the silver ribbon of the Orontes winding peacefully between them. As the friends journeyed, they followed the river's meandering course, crossing bold ridges and dipping into leafy valleys, each set aside for country homes. Oaks, sycamores, myrtles, bays, arbutus, and jasmine filled the air with fragrance. The sunlight shimmered across the river's surface, catching on sails and oars of passing ships, some returning, some setting out, each one stirring thoughts of far-off lands, rare treasures, and stories yet untold. The journey continued until they reached a quiet lake, clear and deep, fed by the river's backflow. At a bend in the inlet, an old palm tree stood watch. Malik, pointing eagerly, broke the stillness with a cry of wonder, announcing their arrival at the Orchard of Palms. The view before them stirred something rare and ancient in the soul, like a forgotten vision from Arabia's hidden oases or the fertile banks of the Nile. A vast, level plain opened wide, carpeted in fresh green grass, a treasure in Syria's parched soil. Above them, a canopy of towering date palms stretched skyward, thick-trunked and venerable, their fronds glittering like wax under the filtered sky. The grass glowed with such color, it seemed to tint the very air. At their feet, the cool lake rippled gently, nourishing the trees in their age-old strength. The palms swayed gently, and their leaves brushed Ben-Hur as he passed beneath, as if offering him a blessing of dewy coolness. The road hugged the lake's edge closely, with palms ruling the landscape on both shores. Malik pointed out one immense tree, explaining that its age could be read in the rings on its trunk. Proof, he said, that the grove might have been planted before even the Seleucid kings had entered Antioch's history. The palm trees, with their stately forms, had long inspired artists and builders, and now they inspired Ben-Hur as well. Yet, despite their wonder, his thoughts turned to Sheikh Ilderim. From his brief sighting earlier that day, the sheikh had seemed unremarkable, perhaps even unworthy in the eyes of Jerusalem's rabbis. But Malik, speaking with pride, recounted the sheikh's noble lineage. He told of a distant ancestor who had once saved a fleeing king, guiding him through the desert with 1,000 loyal horsemen. In return, the king had gifted this very land to the sheikh's family, granting them eternal claim to its waters and palms. Successive rulers had respected that gift, for Ilderim's tribe had grown powerful, guardians of vital trade routes, able to grant peace or deny it. Even the Roman prefect of Antioch considered it a fortunate day when Ilderim, called the generous for his kindness to all men, came down from the desert with his caravan, exchanging harsh wells for the gentle beauty of the orchard. Ben-Hur had been listening, barely noticing the slow gait of the dromedaries. He recalled how the sheik had torn at his beard, cursing himself bitterly for trusting a Roman. In that moment, it occurred to Ben-Hur that even Caesar, had he heard such words, might have muttered disapproval, declaring that a friend so outspoken should be cast aside. Malik, with a slight smile, acknowledged the thought. Ilderim was no lover of Rome, and his bitterness had deep roots. 3 years earlier, Parthian horsemen had crossed the road from Basra to Damascus, attacking a caravan that carried, among other goods, the tax returns for an eastern district. Every living soul in the caravan had been slain. While such brutality might have been overlooked by Roman officials, the loss of imperial treasure was another matter. The tax collectors, now liable for the missing revenues, brought their grievance to Caesar. In turn, Caesar demanded compensation from Herod, who seized the property of Sheikh Ilderim, accusing him of disloyalty and neglect. The sheikh had appealed to Caesar himself, but the response was as cold and distant as if it came from the stone lips of a sphinx. Since that day, the old man had carried the weight of injustice in his heart, nursing his anger and taking comfort in its slow and constant growth. Ben-Hur quietly remarked that Ilderim could do little against such a force. Malik replied that the matter held further detail, promising to explain more if they could ride a little closer. Just then, a cheerful interruption caught their attention. A group of Syrian peasant girls approached with baskets of freshly gathered dates, lifting them up with eager smiles. The dromedaries came to a stop. Ben-Hur leaned down, gratefully accepted the offering, and thanked the girls. At that very moment, a voice called out from a nearby tree, offering peace and welcome. With warm thanks given, the friends resumed their journey, allowing the dromedaries to set the pace. Malik, now munching slowly on a date, continued his story. He explained how the merchant Simonides often trusted him with confidential matters and occasionally sought his advice. Because he frequently visited Simonides' home, he had come to know many of his friends. They, trusting Malika's closeness to their host, spoke openly in his presence. It was through these conversations that Malik had come to know Sheikh Ilderim more personally. Ben-Hur's attention briefly drifted, overtaken by a gentle vision of Esther, the merchant's daughter. In his mind's eye, he saw her again, pure, graceful, and quietly expressive. Her eyes, dark and radiant with the unmistakable brilliance of her heritage, seemed to gaze into his with modest affection. He recalled the sound of her approach, the delicate cadence of her voice offering him the wine, and the silent understanding she had shown him, so genuine, so heartfelt, that it required no words. In fact, words might have only lessened its sweetness. The memory lingered like a pleasant breeze, until he turned once more to Malik, and the vision vanished. Malik, continuing his earlier account, recalled a visit that had taken place just a few weeks prior. On that day, the old Arab had come to Simonides' house, where Malik happened to be present. He had appeared deeply stirred by something important. Out of respect, Malik had offered to leave, but the sheik insisted he stay, explaining that his story might interest an Israelite. That word alone, Israelite, had stirred Malik's curiosity. He remained, and the sheik told a tale which, though Malik now condensed it, was unforgettable. He left the finer details to the sheik himself. Long ago, Ilderim had been visited in his desert camp by 3 strangers, a Hindu, a Greek, and an Egyptian. They arrived on majestic, snow-white camels, the largest the sheik had ever seen. He welcomed them with rest and hospitality. At dawn, they rose and recited a prayer, one unlike any the sheik had ever heard, directed to God and his son, wrapped in deep mystery. Over breakfast, the Egyptian revealed their purpose. Each of them, from distant corners of the world, had seen a star. From that star came a voice, instructing them to journey to Jerusalem and ask, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews?" Guided by the star, they traveled from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, and there, in a humble cave, they found a newborn child. They worshipped the infant, offering treasures and bearing witness to his divine nature. Then, aware that King Herod would not tolerate such a story, they fled at once to Ilderim's camp. True to his custom, the sheik sheltered them for a full year. When they departed, they left behind valuable gifts, each setting off in a different direction. At the end of the tale, Ben-Hur responded with wonder. He repeated the question the 3 were instructed to ask in Jerusalem. Malik confirmed it, though he admitted there had been more to the phrase, words he could no longer recall. Ben-Hur pressed further, asking whether they had truly found the child, and Malik affirmed it with certainty. To Ben-Hur, it seemed nothing short of miraculous. Malik, serious now, spoke of Ilderim's character, emphasizing that the sheik, though passionate, was deeply truthful. A lie could never rest upon his tongue. Lost in the tale, they had forgotten the dromedaries entirely, and the animals, also oblivious to their riders, wandered off the path in search of fresh grass. Ben-Hur then asked if the sheik had heard anything more of the 3 travelers. Malik confirmed that, in fact, the Egyptian had returned only the night before Ilderim's visit to Simonides. He had appeared at the very entrance of a sheik's tent. Ben-Hur inquired how the sheik could recognize the man. Malik explained that it was much like Ben-Hur had known the horses earlier, by his face, his manner, and more tellingly, the same great white camel and the same name, Balthasar the Egyptian. Hearing this, Ben-Hur became deeply stirred. That name, Balthasar, was the same name given by the old man they had met at the fountain that day. Malik, struck by the connection, realized the same, and noted that the camel had been identical. Ben-Hur had saved the man's life, and not only that, the woman with Balthasar was his daughter. This thought held Ben-Hur in reflection, and even the imagined presence of Esther seemed to fade, replaced by this new image, one more vivid, more enduring. Still, his thoughts returned to the mystery. He asked Malik to repeat what the 3 men had been told to ask. Malik clarified, "Where is he that is born to be King of the Jews?" That phrasing, the sheik had never forgotten. Since that day in the desert, Ilderim had waited faithfully, believing that king would come, and that no one could shake that belief. Ben-Hur asked if the king was meant to rule, truly rule. Malak confirmed that the sheik expected him to reign and to bring the fall of Rome. For a moment, Ben-Hur said nothing. His thoughts ran deep. He observed that the sheik was not alone. He was one among millions, each bearing a personal grievance. For them, this strange faith was like bread and wine, nourishment for their hopes. After all, so long as Rome endured, could anyone but a Herod be king of the Jews? Returning to the story, he asked whether Simonides had offered any response. Malak replied that if Ilderim was a man of gravity, then Simonides was a man of wisdom. But before he could continue, a sound reached their ears. The growing rumble of wheels and hooves soon became clear. Sheik Ilderim approached on horseback, followed by a full train, including the 4 wine-red Arabians pulling the chariot. His head, wrapped in a long white beard, was bowed forward. Ben-Hur and Malak had outpaced him on the road. But now, seeing them, the sheik lifted his chin and greeted them with warmth. He spoke kindly, hoping they had not come to say farewell, but rather to bring news from Simonides. In his joy, he invited them to share food, bread, Laban, Eric, and tender meat. With friendly words, he welcomed them to follow. At the tent's entrance, Ilderim stood with a platter holding 3 cups filled with creamy drink, freshly poured from a smoke-stained skin bottle that hung from the central post. He offered it heartily, calling it the fear not of the tent men. They accepted the cups and drank until only foam remained. Then he welcomed them inside, invoking the name of God. Once inside, Malak took the sheik aside for a private word. Then, returning to Ben-Hur, he explained that he had told Ilderim everything. The sheik was now ready to offer a trial of his horses in the morning. Malak had done all he could, and now Ben-Hur must do the rest. He added that he needed to return to Antioch that very night, having promised to meet someone there. But he would return the next day, ready to remain until the end of the games. And with blessings exchanged, Malak departed, riding off into the deepening night. As a general truth, behaving with integrity in the face of others' misdeeds often leads to resentment. Yet in this moment, Malak proved an exception. What he had just witnessed stirred admiration in him. Ben-Hur had revealed courage and skill that could not be denied. Now, if only Malak could gain insight into the young man's past, the day's events would carry more than just momentary meaning. They might prove of real value to Simonides. All that he had learned so far narrowed down to 2 simple facts. The subject of his inquiry was a Jew and the adopted son of a distinguished Roman. Still, Malak's perceptive mind was beginning to sense something more, a mysterious connection between this Jew and Messala, son of the Duumvir. What the nature of that connection was, he couldn't say. No clear solution presented itself, until fate gave him help directly. Ben-Hur, appearing thoughtful and intense, led Malak away from the dispersing crowd and surprised him with a sudden question, one that spoke of pain, of family, and of deep personal loss. Malak, though initially uncertain, responded with heartfelt conviction, affirming an unbreakable bond to one's mother, especially for a true son of Israel. Ben-Hur's expression deepened with emotion, and as memory surged, he shared his story of a father once honored in Jerusalem, of a mother who was both kind and graceful, of a happy home shattered in an instant by Roman violence. The tragedy unfolded swiftly: a Roman official, an accident, a gate broken, and a family torn apart. From that day forward, he had lived without knowledge of his mother or sister's fate. But he recognized the man who stood that day, one who had laughed as his mother pleaded for her children, one who now held the secret that haunted him. Malak listened, moved not just by the sorrow in Ben-Hur's words, but by his restraint. This was no man driven blindly by revenge. He sought justice with purpose. The listener, once a messenger serving another, now felt bound to Ben-Hur himself, driven by genuine respect. As they walked across the meadow, Ben-Hur confided in him a plan, not one of violence, but of justice, with Malak as an ally. They sealed the agreement with a handshake, and with renewed resolve, Ben-Hur turned their steps toward a new purpose. In the quiet that followed, he asked of a man named Sheikh Ilderim in the orchard of palms near Daphne. Though Malak momentarily wondered if the thought of love might be displacing the sorrow of a lost mother, he answered plainly, and also confirmed the upcoming games, wonders yet to unfold on a path now shared between the two. The line of questioning stirred Malak's mind. If not restoring complete confidence, it certainly piqued his curiosity. He explained that the upcoming celebration would be nothing short of magnificent. The prefect, wealthy in his own right, was known for his lavish spending, especially when under pressure to impress those in higher places. With the consul Maxentius soon to arrive in Antioch for preparations against the Parthians, the prefect was compelled to outdo himself. The entire city, seasoned in the art of profiting from such grand occasions, had joined him in honoring the consul. Heralds had already gone forth, declaring the circus games open. The promise of splendor, backed by Antioch's participation, had drawn professionals from distant islands and coastal cities. With royal fees offered, the spectacle would be unparalleled. The circus of Antioch itself, though slightly smaller than Rome's Maximus, boasted similar design and grandeur, with one unique distinction. There, unlike in Rome, all chariots began the race regardless of number, a rule inspired by Greek traditions. This freedom excited Ben-Hur, who learned that he could select both his own chariot and horses. As the conversation deepened, satisfaction began to replace thoughtfulness on his face. When he asked about the date, Malak counted aloud, confirming that the games were to take place 6 days hence. The time frame was tight, but Ben-Hur responded with confidence, vowing to take the reins once more. His past victories in Rome, though unspoken to many, had been decisive, so much so that even the emperor had offered him patronage. Yet, as a Jew, he had refused to tarnish his family's honor by competing under Roman banners. He had practiced in private, but never for prizes. And even now, the prospect of a rich reward held no appeal. His true goal was to bring down his enemy in the most public way possible. Vengeance, after all, was permitted by law. Malak, understanding the sentiment deeply, confirmed that Messala was committed to the race, not only through public announcements, but also through wagers that filled the tablets of Antioch's young elites. Every day, he trained openly, proudly, and visibly. Ben-Hur, recognizing both the chariot and the horses, expressed satisfaction and eagerness to act. He insisted that they travel immediately to the orchard of palms and meet Sheikh Ilderim before his prized steeds were committed elsewhere. Though Malak briefly wondered if some romantic interest had sparked Ben-Hur's urgency, the latter dismissed all such notions with sharp clarity. He had seen the horses only briefly, but their pedigree was unmistakable, glorious beasts of desert blood, rivaled only by those in Caesar's own stables. Just as he could recognize a friend from a fleeting glance, so too could he know those horses again by face, form, and bearing. If their nature could be brought under his control, he was certain of success, not for gold or fame, but for the honor of his house and the justice owed to him. At last, realizing time was precious, the two decided on the quickest path to the Sheikh's tents. Malak led the way toward a nearby village of palatial gardens and princely inns, where they managed to hire swift dromedaries and set off on the road to the legendary orchard of palms. Beyond the village, the land unfolded in soft undulations, richly cultivated as the flourishing garden belt of Antioch. Not a single foot lay untouched by the hand of labor. The terraced slopes bore orderly rows of greenery, while vines climbed along bright hedges, casting cool shade and offering hints of wine yet to come. Clusters of purple grapes hung heavy with ripeness. Whitewashed farmhouses peeked from orchards thick with melons, apricots, figs, oranges, and limes. Everywhere, signs of prosperity abounded, evidence that plenty, the smiling daughter of peace, dwelled there. Her quiet joy stirred warmth even in the heart of a traveler hardened by Rome, leaving one momentarily inclined to give the empire its due. From time to time, glimpses of the distant Taurus and Lebanon rose into view, with the silver ribbon of the Orontes winding peacefully between them. As the friends journeyed, they followed the river's meandering course, crossing bold ridges and dipping into leafy valleys, each set aside for country homes. Oaks, sycamores, myrtles, bays, arbutus, and jasmine filled the air with fragrance. The sunlight shimmered across the river's surface, catching on sails and oars of passing ships, some returning, some setting out, each one stirring thoughts of far-off lands, rare treasures, and stories yet untold. The journey continued until they reached a quiet lake, clear and deep, fed by the river's backflow. At a bend in the inlet, an old palm tree stood watch. Malik, pointing eagerly, broke the stillness with a cry of wonder, announcing their arrival at the orchard of palms. The view before them stirred something rare and ancient in the soul, like a forgotten vision from Arabia's hidden oases or the fertile banks of the Nile. A vast, level plain opened wide, carpeted in fresh green grass, a treasure in Syria's parched soil. Above them, a canopy of towering date palms stretched skyward, thick-trunked and venerable, their fronds glittering like wax under the filtered sky. The grass glowed with such color, it seemed to tint the very air. At their feet, the cool lake rippled gently, nourishing the trees in their age-old strength. The palms swayed gently, and their leaves brushed Ben-Hur as he passed beneath, as if offering him a blessing of dewy coolness. The road hugged the lake's edge closely, with palms ruling the landscape on both shores. Malik pointed out one immense tree, explaining that its age could be read in the rings on its trunk. Proof, he said, that the grove might have been planted before even the Seleucid kings had entered Antioch's history. The palm trees, with their stately forms, had long inspired artists and builders, and now they inspired Ben-Hur as well. Yet, despite their wonder, his thoughts turned to Sheikh Ilderim. From his brief sighting earlier that day, the sheikh had seemed unremarkable, perhaps even unworthy in the eyes of Jerusalem's rabbis. But Malik, speaking with pride, recounted the sheikh's noble lineage. He told of a distant ancestor who had once saved a fleeing king, guiding him through the desert with 1,000 loyal horsemen. In return, the king had gifted this very land to the sheikh's family, granting them eternal claim to its waters and palms. Successive rulers had respected that gift, for Ilderim's tribe had grown powerful, guardians of vital trade routes, able to grant peace or deny it. Even the Roman prefect of Antioch considered it a fortunate day when Ilderim, called the generous for his kindness to all men, came down from the desert with his caravan, exchanging harsh wells for the gentle beauty of the orchard. Ben-Hur had been listening, barely noticing the slow gait of the dromedaries. He recalled how the sheikh had torn at his beard, cursing himself bitterly for trusting a Roman. In that moment, it occurred to Ben-Hur that even Caesar, had he heard such words, might have muttered disapproval, declaring that a friend so outspoken should be cast aside. Malik, with a slight smile, acknowledged the thought. Ilderim was no lover of Rome, and his bitterness had deep roots. 3 years earlier, Parthian horsemen had crossed the road from Basra to Damascus, attacking a caravan that carried, among other goods, the tax returns for an eastern district. Every living soul in the caravan had been slain. While such brutality might have been overlooked by Roman officials, the loss of imperial treasure was another matter. The tax collectors, now liable for the missing revenues, brought their grievance to Caesar. In turn, Caesar demanded compensation from Herod, who seized the property of Sheikh Ilderim, accusing him of disloyalty and neglect. The sheikh had appealed to Caesar himself, but the response was as cold and distant as if it came from the stone lips of a sphinx. Since that day, the old man had carried the weight of injustice in his heart, nursing his anger and taking comfort in its slow and constant growth. Ben-Hur quietly remarked that Ilderim could do little against such a force. Malak replied that the matter held further detail, promising to explain more if they could ride a little closer. Just then, a cheerful interruption caught their attention. A group of Syrian peasant girls approached with baskets of freshly gathered dates, lifting them up with eager smiles. The dromedaries came to a stop. Ben-Hur leaned down, gratefully accepted the offering, and thanked the girls. At that very moment, a voice called out from a nearby tree, offering peace and welcome. With warm thanks given, the friends resumed their journey, allowing the dromedaries to set the pace. Malak, now munching slowly on a date, continued his story. He explained how the merchant Simonides often trusted him with confidential matters and occasionally sought his advice. Because he frequently visited Simonides' home, he had come to know many of his friends. They, trusting Malak's closeness to their host, spoke openly in his presence. It was through these conversations that Malak had come to know Sheikh Ilderim more personally. Ben-Hur's attention briefly drifted, overtaken by a gentle vision of Esther, the merchant's daughter. In his mind's eye, he saw her again, pure, graceful, and quietly expressive. Her eyes, dark and radiant with the unmistakable brilliance of her heritage, seemed to gaze into his with modest affection. He recalled the sound of her approach, the delicate cadence of her voice offering him the wine, and the silent understanding she had shown him. So genuine, so heartfelt, that it required no words. In fact, words might have only lessened its sweetness. The memory lingered like a pleasant breeze, until he turned once more to Malak, and the vision vanished. Malak, continuing his earlier account, recalled a visit that had taken place just a few weeks prior. On that day, the old Arab had come to Simonides' house, where Malak happened to be present. He had appeared deeply stirred by something important. Out of respect, Malak had offered to leave, but the sheikh insisted he stay, explaining that his story might interest an Israelite. That word alone, Israelite, had stirred Malak's curiosity. He remained, and the sheikh told a tale which, though Malak now condensed it, was unforgettable. He left the finer details to the sheikh himself. Long ago, Ilderim had been visited in his desert camp by 3 strangers, a Hindu, a Greek, and an Egyptian. They arrived on majestic, snow-white camels, the largest the sheikh had ever seen. He welcomed them with rest and hospitality. At dawn, they rose and recited a prayer, one unlike any the sheikh had ever heard, directed to God and his son, wrapped in deep mystery. Over breakfast, the Egyptian revealed their purpose. Each of them, from distant corners of the world, had seen a star. From that star came a voice, instructing them to journey to Jerusalem and ask, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews?" Guided by the star, they traveled from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, and there, in a humble cave, they found a newborn child. They worshipped the infant, offering treasures and bearing witness to his divine nature. Then, aware that King Herod would not tolerate such a story, they fled at once to Ilderim's camp. True to his custom, the sheikh sheltered them for a full year. When they departed, they left behind valuable gifts, each setting off in a different direction. At the end of the tale, Ben-Hur responded with wonder. He repeated the question the 3 were instructed to ask in Jerusalem. Malak confirmed it, though he admitted there had been more to the phrase, words he could no longer recall. Ben-Hur pressed further, asking whether they had truly found the child, and Malak affirmed it with certainty. To Ben-Hur, it seemed nothing short of miraculous. Malik, serious now, spoke of Ildirim's character, emphasizing that the sheik, though passionate, was deeply truthful. A lie could never rest upon his tongue. Lost in the tale, they had forgotten the dromedaries entirely, and the animals, also oblivious to their riders, wandered off the path in search of fresh grass. Ben-Hur then asked if the sheik had heard anything more of the three travelers. Malik confirmed that, in fact, the Egyptian had returned only the night before Ildirim's visit to Simonides. He had appeared at the very entrance of the sheik's tent. Ben-Hur inquired how the sheik could recognize the man. Malik explained that it was much like Ben-Hur had known the horses earlier, by his face, his manner, and more tellingly, the same great white camel and the same name, Balthasar the Egyptian. Hearing this, Ben-Hur became deeply stirred. That name, Balthasar, was the same name given by the old man they had met at the fountain that day. Malik, struck by the connection, realized the same and noted that the camel had been identical. Ben-Hur had saved the man's life, and not only that, the woman with Balthasar was his daughter. This thought held Ben-Hur in reflection, and even the imagined presence of Esther seemed to fade, replaced by this new image, one more vivid, more enduring. Still, his thoughts returned to the mystery. He asked Malik to repeat what the three men had been told to ask. Malik clarified, "Where is he that is born to be king of the Jews?" That phrasing, the sheik had never forgotten. Since that day in the desert, Ildirim had waited faithfully, believing that king would come, and that no one could shake that belief. Ben-Hur asked if the king was meant to rule, truly rule. Malik confirmed that the sheik expected him to reign and to bring the fall of Rome. For a moment, Ben-Hur said nothing. His thoughts ran deep. He observed that the sheik was not alone. He was one among millions, each bearing a personal grievance. For them, this strange faith was like bread and wine, nourishment for their hopes. After all, so long as Rome endured, could anyone but a Herod be king of the Jews? Returning to the story, he asked whether Simonides had offered any response. Malik replied that if Ildirim was a man of gravity, then Simonides was a man of wisdom. But before he could continue, a sound reached their ears. The growing rumble of wheels and hooves soon became clear. Sheik Ildirim approached on horseback, followed by a full train, including the 4 wine-red Arabians pulling the chariot. His head, wrapped in a long white beard, was bowed forward. Ben-Hur and Malik had outpaced him on the road. But now, seeing them, the sheik lifted his chin and greeted them with warmth. He spoke kindly, hoping they had not come to say farewell, but rather to bring news from Simonides. In his joy, he invited them to share food, bread, Laban, Eric, and tender meat. With friendly words, he welcomed them to follow. At the tent's entrance, Ildirim stood with a platter holding 3 cups filled with creamy drink, freshly poured from a smoke-stained skin bottle that hung from the central post. He offered it heartily, calling it the fear not of the tent men. They accepted the cups and drank until only foam remained. Then, he welcomed them inside, invoking the name of God. Once inside, Malik took the sheik aside for a private word. Then, returning to Ben-Hur, he explained that he had told Ildirim everything. The sheik was now ready to offer a trial of his horses in the morning. Malik had done all he could, and now, Ben-Hur must do the rest. He added that he needed to return to Antioch that very night, having promised to meet someone there. But he would return the next day, ready to remain until the end of the games. And with blessings exchanged, Malik departed, riding off into the deepening night. Sheik Ildirim was a man of remarkable importance, both in the desert and in the cities. Among his tribe, he carried himself as a prince and a patriarch, commanding the greatest following east of Syria. In the cities, his reputation was different, yet equally grand. He was known as one of the richest men in all the East, though he was not a king. His wealth stretched across gold, silver, servants, camels, horses, and vast flocks. And like any man of such standing, he enjoyed a life that displayed dignity, pride, and comfort. The tent in the orchard of palms, often mentioned in stories about him, was not a single, lonely shelter. In truth, he had an entire encampment, a proper dower. There were 3 large tents, one for the sheik himself, one for his honored guests, and another for his favorite wife and her women. Around them stood 6 or 8 smaller tents, where his loyal servants and chosen tribesmen lived. These men were his bodyguard, strong, brave, and skilled with bow, spear, and horse. Even here, near the orchard, where his property was safe from thieves and wild beasts, his habits of careful order and discipline never left him. Inside the dower, he kept his cows, camels, goats, and all valuables that might attract danger in the open desert. Ilderim followed the customs of his people faithfully, never neglecting even the smallest tradition. His life in the orchard was simply an extension of his life in the desert, a living echo of the old patriarchal days, the true pastoral existence of ancient Israel. When his caravan first arrived at the orchard, the sheik selected the perfect spot for his main tent. He imagined the entrance facing south, the lake shimmering in front, and the shade of 3 tall palms where he could rest at sunset. He touched the palm trunks affectionately, with the same warmth he might show to a beloved horse or a cherished child. Only he had the right to direct the caravan. His spear marked the center of the tent's doorway. Around that point, the pillars of the great tent were set, 3 rows, 3 pillars in each row. Then, at his call, the women and children began their work. They untied the canvas from the camels, the same canvas they had crafted themselves from the hair of brown goats, sheared, spun, woven, and stitched with care. Piece by piece, they stretched the dark brown fabric, pulling it tight from pillar to pillar. Stakes were driven, ropes were fastened, and laughter filled the air as the great tent rose. Once the outer walls of reed matting were secured, the work neared its completion. The sheik examined every detail, the sunlight, the shade of the trees, the reflection of the lake, and was satisfied. With joy in their hearts, his people went to pitch their own smaller tents, while a few remained to prepare the sheik's private space. Inside, they divided the main tent into 2 sections, one for the sheik himself, the other for his prized horses, his true treasures. They led the animals in gently, treating them like jewels, and set them free within the shaded enclosure. A rack was set up against the central pillar to hold his weapons, javelins, spears, bows, arrows, and shields. His sword, curved like a new moon and glittering with jeweled grip, hung in the place of honor. On one side of the rack were the colorful horse trappings, bright as the livery of a royal servant. On the other side hung his garments, wool and linen robes, tunics, trousers, and headscarves of many colors. Only when the sheik walked through the finished space, proud and content, did the work finally come to an end. Inside the great tent, the women began arranging the sheik's divan. To him, it was more essential than the flowing white beard upon his chest, gleaming like Aaron's. They formed a frame shaped like 3 sides of a square, its opening facing the tent door. Cushions and base curtains were placed, then a striped brown and yellow cover draped over the cushions. At the corners, pillows and bolsters in blue and crimson brightened the space. A border of carpet surrounded the divan, and the inner area was fully carpeted as well. A final strip of carpet led from the divan to the entrance of the tent. The last touches followed. Jars were filled with water, and skin bottles of arak were hung, ready for use. By morning, there would also be Laban. In that tranquil setting, by the lake of sweet waters, beneath the palms of the orchard, any Arab could see that Ilderim had every reason to be both happy and generous. This was the very tent before which Ben-Hur had paused. Servants awaited their master's signal. One knelt to remove his sandals. Another unlatched the Roman shoes of Ben-Hur. Dusty garments were replaced with fresh white linen. The sheik then guided his guest to the divan. A handmaid quickly arranged the pillows and bolsters for their backs. When they settled, water drawn fresh from the lake was brought to wash their feet, and soft napkins dried them. In that moment, the host reflected on the desert wisdom that a strong appetite promised a long life. Ben-Hur's hunger was great, and it pleased the sheik. Soon, preparations for the meal began. Messengers were sent to the guest's tent with greetings of peace and an invitation to share the bread. The sheik also extended the offer to Balthasar, the wise man, so that all three might dine together without diminishing the portion for anyone, not even the birds that would later enjoy the remnants. When the messengers departed, the sheik reclined upon the divan, in the familiar posture of a Damascus merchant resting in his bazaar. His fingers paused in the combing of his beard. His thoughts turned serious, for custom allowed a host, after offering food and drink, to inquire about the identity of his guest. He considered the honor of the covenant and the trust he would soon extend. Ben-Hur, calm and measured, revealed what the sheik needed to know. He was no Roman, despite the name given to the sheik. He was an Israelite of the tribe of Judah, a Jew burdened with a grievance against Rome far greater than any the sheik himself had known. His heart carried a vow for revenge, and he promised that, if given the opportunity to fulfill it, the wealth and glory of the coming chariot race will belong to Ilderim as well. The sheik studied him closely. His brows first drew heavy in thought, then lifted as satisfaction began to warm his face. He believed the young man. Trust was forming, born from shared enmity and mutual ambition. The conversation turned to skill and experience. The sheik's thoughts were clear. Wealth and courage were not enough. Mastery over the chariot, and, more importantly, over the horses, was a gift given to few. Horses were not dull brutes, enslaved to simple labor. The sheik's steeds were kings of their kind, descended from the noble bloodlines that reached back to the first pharaohs. They were his companions, his tent dwellers, his partners in both pride and war. Through long years together, they had absorbed the instincts and emotions of their master, learning ambition, loyalty, and even the capacity to share in his joy and his wrath. In battle, they were heroes. In trust, faithful as the most devoted of women. At that thought, the sheik's voice rose in command, calling out to those nearby, the sound echoing through the great tent. A servant stepped forward, and, at his master's silent signal, the curtain of the tent was drawn aside. Behind it stood a group of horses, hesitant for a moment, as though waiting to be sure they were welcome. Slowly, with the confidence of creatures who knew they were cherished, the horses entered the tent. The sheik's pride and affection for them radiated in every gesture. He moved toward the first horse to approach him, touching its face with a hand that carried both authority and tenderness. Each of these creatures was a living treasure, a reflection of generations of devotion. To the sheik, they were far more than animals. They were companions, heirs to the noblest bloodlines of the desert. Ben-Hur observed them with admiration. One of the horses, a magnificent creature with soft, deer-like eyes beneath a dense forelock and sharply pointed ears, stepped forward until its muzzle brushed his chest. The horse sniffed the air, nostrils wide, its upper lip quivering with curiosity. Ben-Hur recognized it as one of the 4 racers he had seen on the course, and instinctively, he extended his open hand in greeting. The sheik's thoughts turned toward the heritage of his beloved steeds. In the heart of the desert, he remembered God had given the first Arab a barren land of sand and harsh winds. Yet there, in a hidden oasis, were the gifts of camels and horses, the finest blessings of all. From that green island of the desert, the bloodlines had spread to every corner of the earth. These horses, standing now beneath his tent, were the descendants of those first divine gifts. Their lineage, pure and unbroken, was a source of pride deeper than wealth. At the sheik's command, servants brought cedar chests bound with brass, each one heavy with the records of the tribe. Only the chest of the horses was opened, revealing ivory tablets strung with silver wire. Though wafer thin, the rings held hundreds of them. Each tablet bore the name of a foal of pure blood, along with the names of its sire and dam. Some were worn smooth by the passing of years. All carried the weight of history. These records, preserved like sacred scrolls, told the complete story of the lineage, each horse a living link to its ancestors who had once eaten from the hands of the sheik's forefathers under similar tent roofs, kissed like children, and loved as family. The sheik's pride deepened as he moved among his horses. To him, they were his ministers, his strength on the open highways, the reason his name inspired both fear and respect in the desert. Their speed, their endurance, and their unyielding spirit had never failed his people. On the sands and under the saddle, their ancestors had outrun pursuers and never faltered in pursuit. Yet now, the challenge was new. For the first time, these noble creatures would be under the yoke of the chariot. Success would depend not only on their strength, but on the hand that guided them. If the right master could awaken their full power, victory was certain. Ben-Hur felt the weight of the moment. He now understood why, in the heart of an Arab, a horse came next only to his children, and why these horses were considered the finest in the world. But he also knew that words were not enough. A trial was needed. He resolved that on the following day, he would take the four into his hands and prove himself worthy of their trust. Ilderim's face lit up with pride and anticipation. Yet before he could speak, Ben-Hur continued with measured confidence. He recalled the lessons learned long ago from the masters of Rome, lessons he had never imagined would one day serve him in a moment such as this. The young Israelite reflected that the sheik's proud horses, swift as eagles and enduring as lions, would fail if they were not trained to run together under the yoke. In every team of four, there was always one the swiftest and one the slowest. A race was ruled by the pace of the slowest, yet the challenge always lay with the fastest. Ben-Hur had seen it that very day. The driver could not bring the best horse into harmony with the weakest, and so the team faltered. He resolved that his own trial might bring the same result. If it did, he would admit it without hesitation. But if he succeeded, if he could unite all four to move as one, driven entirely by his will, the reward would be shared. The sheik would gain the crown and the Roman prize, and he himself would finally have his revenge. The sheik listened closely, his fingers combing through his long beard. When Ben-Hur finished, the old man's laughter rumbled warmly in the tent. He admired the young man's spirit and determination. In the desert, they said that a meal made only of words would need an ocean of butter to satisfy the hungry. But the sheik's heart had decided. The horses would be given into Ben-Hur's hands at dawn. At that moment, movement stirred at the rear entrance of the tent. The evening meal had arrived, and with it came Balthasar, the wise man, carrying a story that no son of Israel could ever tire of hearing. Servants moved quickly to clear the space, carrying away the cedar chests of records and returning the sheik's cherished jewels to their resting place among the horses. The tent filled with the warmth of hospitality, the promise of food, and the unspoken weight of plans for the trials to come. The preparations for the supper in Ilderim's tent reflected the same hospitality once shown to the wise men in the desert, only now with greater means and finer service. Inside the space bordered by the divan, 3 rugs were spread upon the carpet. A low table, barely a foot high, was set in the center and covered with a cloth. Off to one side, a small earthenware oven glowed under the care of a woman whose task was to keep the company supplied with fresh bread, hot cakes of flour ground in the hand mills that hummed in a nearby tent. Balthasar arrived slowly, supported by a long staff and the arm of a servant. A loose black gown draped his frail frame, and every step was measured and careful. Ilderim and Ben-Hur rose to receive him. The sheik greeted the aged Egyptian with warmth and respect, and the guest returned the salutation with gentle devotion, invoking the peace and blessing of the one true and loving God. The moment left an impression on Ben-Hur. The hollow yet luminous eyes of the old man rested on his face long enough to stir a deep and mysterious emotion. That expression, serene, trustful, and almost childlike, seemed to linger there habitually, and the young Israelite found himself glancing at it again and again during the meal. Ilderim then introduced Ben-Hur as the one who would share their bread that evening. Balthasar's surprise was evident, his gaze lingering on the young man with doubt and wonder. The sheik explained that this guest would take his horses for a trial the next day, and, if all went well, would drive them in the circus. He spoke of Ben-Hur's Roman connection by adoption, yet swore that he believed the youth to be a true son of Judah. Recognition dawned upon the Egyptian. He recalled that his own life had been in peril earlier that day, and that a youth, identical to the one before him, had intervened when all others fled. He understood now that this was the same rescuer from the fountain of Castalia. Ben-Hur, with quiet humility, confirmed it and presented the small cup that Balthasar's daughter had left with him. A glow of gratitude touched the old man's face as he accepted the cup. He saw divine providence in the meeting at the fountain and in this encounter now. His heart trembled with thanks to the Almighty, and he promised a reward in return, though Ben-Hur declined any claim of service for gain. The young man insisted that the act would have been given to the humblest servant as readily as to the most honored guest. Ilderim's pride flared at this, for the laws of the desert bound the fate of guest and host together. To harm or aid a guest was to harm or aid the sheik himself. Yet the youth's disinterestedness, pure and without demand for reward, struck Balthasar deeply. It echoed the very spirit of his own devotion, in which kindness and redemption were universal. The Egyptian's curiosity grew gentle and childlike. He inquired about the name by which the sheik had introduced the young man. Ben-Hur gave the Roman name he had carried, but affirmed that all his people were Jews. The conversation touched briefly on the subtle sorrow in his words, on family lost and past lives left behind, but before the moment could deepen, Ilderim intervened with cheerful practicality. The meal was ready. Ben-Hur gently offered his arm to Balthasar, guiding the aged Egyptian to the low table. Soon, all were seated upon their rugs in the Eastern fashion. Servants brought the lavers, and they washed and dried their hands in quiet ritual. Then, with a single sign from Ilderim, the tent grew still. The voice of Balthasar rose, trembling with reverent emotion, offering thanks to the Father of all. He blessed the meal as one who knew every morsel to be the gift of heaven, praying for the strength to continue in the path of the divine will. It was the same simple grace he had once spoken in the desert, years before, alongside his brethren Gaspar the Greek and Melchior the Hindu. Then, diverse tongues had lifted one harmony of worship, and the very act had seemed to summon the presence of God. The feast before them was abundant and purely Eastern. There were hot cakes fresh from the oven, vegetables gathered from the garden, tender meats, and savory mixtures of meat and herbs. Bowls of milk, sweet honey, and golden butter completed the offering. No knives, forks, or cups were used. They ate with their hands, as had been the custom for ages. At first, little was said, for their hunger demanded silence. When the first course ended and the dessert appeared, the mood changed. Hand relaved again, lap cloths were shaken out, and the table renewed. Hunger eased. The company grew inclined to speak and to listen. Here, 3 men sat together, an Arab, a Jew, and an Egyptian, all bound by belief in the one God. In that time and place, there could be only one subject worthy of their conversation. And of the 3, it was clear who must speak, the man to whom the divine had drawn near as a living presence. He had seen the promise in a star, heard the guiding voice, and followed the Spirit across deserts and years. His words, as always, could only testify to the wonder he had been called to witness. The sun had dropped behind the mountains, and the orchard of palms lay beneath swift falling shadows. There was no gentle violet twilight to soften the world, no lingering hour between day and night. Darkness came suddenly, and with it, the servants moved quietly about the tent. For tall candlesticks of brass were brought and placed at the corners of the low table. Each bore 4 silver lamps, their olive oil cups glowing with steady light, filling the space with a warm brilliance. In that golden glow, the small gathering continued their conversation in the Syriac tongue, familiar to all in that land. Balthasar, with his slow, devout voice, recounted the story of the 3 wise men and their meeting in the desert so many years before. He recalled how, fleeing from the wrath of Herod, they had found refuge beneath a humble tent, praying for safety. His tale, vivid and solemn, drew every listener into its mystery. Even the servants lingered, catching fragments of the account whenever they dared. For Ben-Hur, the narrative struck deep. He listened as if to a revelation touching all of humanity, yet one that bound itself most fiercely to the heart of Israel. An idea was slowly forming within him, an idea that would alter his life, perhaps consume it entirely. By the end of the story, he felt a profound conviction of its truth. Nothing was left to him but the desire for understanding, the consequences, the meaning, the promise that lay hidden within the event. It is at this moment in the tale that an explanation must come. The story now moves nearer to the days of the Son of Mary, whom the reader has glimpsed only once, an infant in his mother's arms in the cave of Bethlehem, worshipped by this same Balthasar. From this point forward, that child would become a constant presence in the story, drawing events steadily toward him. Slowly, the narrative would reveal him as a man the world could not do without. Many have been indispensable to nations or to their own times, but his necessity was for all people and for all ages, unique, solitary, and divine. Sheikh Ilderim, hearing the story again, felt no surprise. He had long ago listened to the 3 wise men together and had risked his own safety to aid their flight from Herod's vengeance. He believed every word, though the truth touched him only in a distant, general way. He was an Arab. The consequences of the story belonged to the world beyond his tents. But for Ben-Hur, the tale struck like a flame to dry wood. He was an Israelite, a Jew. From his earliest memory, he had heard the name of the Messiah whispered and proclaimed. In the synagogues and schools, on feast days and in the temple courts, the rabbis had told and retold the promises of the prophets. From the first to the last, the sacred voices spoke of one who was the hope and the glory of Israel. Everywhere, in public and in private, the expectation ruled life with an iron hand. And though debate had always existed, it circled only one question, one that burned in every Jewish heart. When would the Messiah come? The tale now turns to the great expectation of Israel. Among the chosen people, one belief united every heart with astonishing certainty. The Messiah, when he came, would be the king of the Jews. He would be a political king, a conqueror, their own Caesar. Through his power, Israel would subdue the earth, and for their glory, in the name of God, hold it in eternal dominion. The Pharisees, called separatists in political speech, built their vast edifice of hope upon this vision. Their dream soared beyond the ambition of Alexander. His conquests only covered the earth. Theirs reached into the heavens. For in their boundless self-assurance they imagined that even the Almighty would become their eternal servant, fastening himself to their destiny forever. Yet Ben-Hur's life had been shaped by 2 influences that kept him free from the harsher edges of this national obsession. His father had followed the faith of the Sadducees, the liberals of the age. They were strict in observing the law of Moses, but they dismissed the endless rabbinical addenda with disdain. Their religion was more a philosophy than a creed. They enjoyed the pleasures of life and found merit in the achievements of Gentiles. Politically, they opposed the separatists. By the natural order of inheritance, these tendencies had begun to pass into the son, until a second event changed his path forever. 5 years of life in Rome had left their mark on him. The city was the meeting place of the world, its heart beating with the currents of all nations. Around the golden milestone of the Forum flowed the ceaseless tides of humanity. Kings, princes, ambassadors, hostages, and petitioners from every land, all humbling themselves before the power that could make or break them with a single word. If Jerusalem, during the Passover, offered the largest gatherings of his youth, Rome offered something different, a vision of the world. Sitting under the purple awnings of the Circus Maximus, one of 350,000 spectators, he must have felt a stirring thought, that beyond Judea, there were other branches of mankind, uncircumcised yet worthy of divine consideration. He saw their sorrows, their hopelessness, and perhaps wondered if the promises of God might someday reach them as well. The misery of the masses was everywhere, yet he saw that it did not spring from religion. Across the world, the gods of men still held their places. The Druids ruled Britain. Odin and Freya reigned in the northern forests. Egypt clung to Anubis and the sacred crocodile. The Persians honored Ormuzd and Ahriman, and the Hindus moved patiently in the shadowed paths of Brahm. Greece still sang of the heroic gods of Homer, and Rome itself overflowed with divinities, so common and cheap that emperors were raised to godhood in life. The universal suffering did not cry out for new gods. It cried for deliverance from misrule and tyranny. The prayers rising from Laudanum, Alexandria, Athens, and Jerusalem were all the same, not for a deity to worship, but for a king to follow into victory. 2,000 years later, it is clear that true relief could only have come from a God who proved himself both real and sovereign, a savior of mankind. But in that age, the hearts of men saw hope only in the crushing of Rome. They plotted, rebelled, and bled the earth with wars and tears, seeking a conqueror, not a redeemer. Ben-Hur now stood in agreement with the vast multitude of the world that was not Roman. His 5 years in the capital had given him the clearest view of the misery that weighed upon the conquered nations. He believed, as most did, that the suffering of the age was political, and that the only cure lay in the sword. He had already mastered the arts of personal combat, yet he knew that war demanded more than the skill of a single soldier. To rise beyond the rank and file, to guide an army, to mold the will of thousands into the will of one, that was the higher field of battle. The perfect captain was not only a fighter, but the living embodiment of his army, its mind and its heart. This vision of war shaped his destiny. It promised the surest path to the vengeance he had long dreamed of, to avenge the wrongs done to him and his house, to strike Rome at the heart. The way of the sword seemed the only way. Thus, when Balthasar spoke, his words struck the deepest chords within Ben-Hur's soul. His heart raced as he listened. Not a doubt touched him. The story was true. The child so miraculously revealed was indeed the Messiah. A wonder took hold of him. How could Israel remain so unmoved? How had this revelation remained hidden from him until that day? And as awe settled over him, 2 questions rose in his mind, burning and irresistible. Where was the child now? And what was his mission on earth? These thoughts pressed upon him with a force he could not resist. He turned to Balthasar, seeking answers, eager to hear the wisdom of the man who had followed the star and seen the miracle with his own eyes. Balthasar, with a deep sincerity and quiet devotion in his tone, expressed that if he only knew where the child was, he would go to him without hesitation. No sea or mountain could hold him back. He had, in fact, tried to find the child. That very mission had been his first task after leaving the desert, where he had found shelter, thanks to the kindness of Ilderim. But time had passed, and fear of Herod's ruthless reign kept him from venturing into Judea himself. Upon his return to Egypt, he shared his story with a few faithful friends, those who believed in the miraculous birth, those who rejoiced with him and never tired of hearing the tale. Some among them journeyed in his stead, first to Bethlehem, where they found the Khan and the cave. But the man who had kept the gate on that night, the night of the star, had vanished. Taken away by order of the king, he had never been seen again. Yet what they discovered was chilling. There were signs written in blood, a grieving village, and mothers still mourning their children. When Herod heard of the travelers' escape, he had ordered the slaughter of all the youngest born in Bethlehem. None had been spared. The messengers came back believing the child had perished with the others. Balthasar, however, had never accepted that report, neither then nor now. He claimed no secret knowledge. After offering their gifts and witnessing the child in the cave, the guiding star had disappeared. The spirit that had led them so far had left them to walk the rest of the way alone. The last divine urging he could remember was the one that had brought them to Ilderim for protection. Ilderim himself recalled that moment, the claim that they had been sent by a spirit. And now, seeing Ben-Hur troubled, Balthasar continued, gently but firmly. Though he lacked proof, he had pondered the matter for years. His belief, born of faith, nurtured through time, remained as unshakable as when he first heard the voice by the lakeshore. And if allowed, he wished to explain why he believed the child still lived. Both Ilderim and Ben-Hur gave their silent approval, drawing their full attention to what was about to be said. Even the servants stepped closer, drawn by the growing hush that filled the tent. All three shared a belief in God, and God, Balthasar reminded them, was truth itself. His word, once given, would stand forever, even if the mountains crumbled or the seas vanished into the wind. With solemn reverence, Balthasar recalled the voice that had once spoken to him by the water. It had declared him blessed and foretold the coming of redemption. The Savior he had seen with his own eyes. But redemption, the second part of the promise, was still unfulfilled. And if the child had died, there could be no redemption. That thought alone, unspeakable and dreadful, caused him to recoil. For the child had been born to fulfill a sacred mission. So long as that purpose remained, not even death could separate him from it. That alone was the first reason for his unwavering belief. He paused, and Ilderim, with quiet courtesy, offered wine. Balthasar drank, and then went on, his spirit refreshed. The Savior he had seen had been fully human, born of woman, vulnerable to all the pains of life, even to death. Yet his purpose required more than mere presence. It demanded growth, wisdom, discretion, qualities only time could bring. Between childhood and maturity lay many threats. Herod was already an enemy. Rome would surely have been another. And even among his own people, rejection was almost certain. Thus, Balthasar reasoned, the safest path would have been obscurity, to hide the child from the world until the time was right. This, his loving faith accepted. The child was not dead, only lost. And since the mission remained unfinished, he would surely return. Ben-Hur, shaken from his despair, found comfort in the reasoning. He acknowledged its strength and asked if there was more. Balthasar, with gentler calm, explained that once he realized the child was meant to remain hidden, he turned his faith toward patience. And so he waited still, with trust in the promise and the unshakable belief that the child lived. Perhaps now as a blossom still forming, or perhaps already near fulfillment. But without doubt, he lived. Ben-Hur, moved deeply, felt the last shadows of doubt fading from his heart. And in a voice lowered by reverence, he asked where the child might be. Balthasar regarded Ben-Hur with gentle eyes, his thoughts still partially adrift in contemplation. He spoke of a quiet moment in his home by the Nile, a house nestled so close to the river that its image reflected beside the passing boats. Not long ago, he had sat there, musing over time. A man of 30, he thought, should have already tilled his life's fields and begun reaping the fruits of his labor. After 30, life enters its summer, a season too short to ripen what has not already been sown. The child, he realized then, must now be 27. His time to act, his season to sow, must be near. Just as Ben-Hur had wondered, so too had Balthasar questioned where the child might begin his divine work. And so, he had journeyed to Judea, resting near the very land once gifted to the forefathers of faith. For where else would the promised one appear, if not in that sacred place? What city could be more fitting than Jerusalem? Who more deserving of his blessings than the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, those called the children of the Lord? Balthasar imagined him standing now on a hilltop or in a doorway, perhaps watching the sun dip below the horizon, one day closer to the moment when he himself would become the light of the world. With a hand lifted toward the direction of Judea, Balthasar's passion left the tent filled with a hush so deep that even the lowliest servants were stirred. The atmosphere shimmered with an unspoken majesty, and all remained still in thought, the weight of his words lingering. It was Ben-Hur who finally broke the silence, moved by all he had heard. Grateful for the insight, he admitted a feeling both honored and warned. Great events seemed near, and Balthasar's unwavering faith stirred his own. He asked to know more about the child's mission, this one he, too, would now wait for, as a believing son of Judah. Was the Savior also meant to be king of the Jews? With a fatherly calm, Balthasar confessed that the mission remained hidden within the will of God. His understanding came only from the voice that once spoke to him, a voice that answered his deepest prayer. Long ago, in Alexandria and along the Nile, he had mourned the broken state of humanity, not just one people, but all. To him, the root of their suffering was the loss of knowledge about God. Redemption, he believed, could only come if God himself intervened. And so he had prayed, not for rescue alone, but for the chance to witness the coming. The voice answered with divine assurance. Redemption was near, and he would see the Savior. This redemption, Balthasar believed, was for the whole world. Yet he acknowledged how others saw the problem differently. Some believed there could be no peace until Rome itself had fallen. They sought a political change, blaming rulers for their hardships. But Balthasar had come to understand, human governments do not exist for the sake of righteousness. Kings were seldom better than those they ruled. Redemption could not simply mean the fall of thrones. That would make divine wisdom no greater than human ambition. No, the one who was to come would not merely lead nations, but save souls. Redemption would mean God returning to the earth, and through that return, restoring righteousness so that his presence might endure. Though Ben-Hur could not argue with the Egyptian, a quiet sorrow spread across his face. Ilderim, on the other hand, reacted with force. The world, he believed, could not change without power and leadership. Reform required command. But Balthasar responded with solemn clarity. Worldly wisdom sought to rule men. Divine purpose longed to redeem their souls. Ben-Hur, turning the matter over in his heart, spoke again, this time as a son might speak to a father. He asked what Balthasar had been told to seek at the gates of Jerusalem. The answer was clear. He had been told to inquire where the one-born king of the Jews might be found. And indeed, they had found him in Bethlehem, worshipped him in the humble cave, and offered their gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Ben-Hur accepted Balthasar's words as truth, yet struggled to grasp the nature of such a king. To him, rulership implied power and duty, strength and action. But Balthasar gently challenged him to look beyond titles and appearances. Israel, in its better days, had walked closely with God. The promise of a Savior had come during those times. And if the promise called him King of the Jews, then the title had to be fulfilled, at least in name. It explained why Balthasar had asked such a question at Jerusalem's gate. But if the thought turned toward earthly status, toward being a successor to Herod, that, Balthasar believed, was beneath the dignity of God's beloved. Surely, God would not borrow from the thrones of men. If he had wanted to name a Caesar, would he not have done so directly? Instead, Balthasar urged them to look higher. The true question was not what title the child would bear, but what he would be king of. That, he said, was the key. Without it, the mystery could not be unlocked. He raised his eyes in reverence, speaking now of a kingdom not of this world, a realm larger than earth or sea, a place as real as the soul itself, though unseen. Every human soul journeys through this invisible dominion, though few ever perceive it, and no one shall see it until they come to truly know their own soul. This kingdom belongs not to the body, but to the spirit, and within it lies a glory untouched by imagination, pure, original, and beyond comparison. Ben-Hur admitted he could not understand such a kingdom. Ilderim, too, confessed his unfamiliarity, and Balthasar, lowering his gaze with humility, explained that little more could be said. What the kingdom truly is, what it's meant for, or how one might enter it. None can fully know until the child comes to claim it. He alone holds the key to that hidden gate, and when he opens it, only those who love him, those marked by faith, will pass through. A stillness returned to the tent, deep and thoughtful. Sensing that the conversation had come to its close, Balthasar rose in his usual peaceful manner. He mentioned that he would visit the city soon, perhaps the next day, at the request of his daughter, who wished to see the preparations for the games. He promised to speak more on the matter in time, and assured them that he would return. Offering a farewell of peace, he departed. All stood from the table. Ben-Hur and Ilderim remained, watching as Balthasar was gently led away from the tent. At last, Ben-Hur turned to the sheik and requested leave to walk beside the lake, needing solitude to reflect on the truths he had heard. Ilderim agreed and promised to follow soon after. Their hands were washed once more. A servant brought Ben-Hur his shoes, and quietly, he stepped out into the night. A short distance from the dower, a small grove of palms rose beside the shore, casting their shadows partly on the land, partly over the still waters. From their branches, a bulbul sang a lilting melody, as though calling out in welcome. Ben-Hur paused beneath their shade, listening. At another time, the bird's song might have brought ease to his thoughts, but tonight, the tale of the Egyptian lay heavily upon him, a burden of wonder, which he carried like a laborer under strain. And, like any laborer, no melody, however sweet, could soothe him until mind and body found rest together. The night lay utterly still. The lake's surface was unbroken by even a ripple. Overhead, the same ancient stars shone in their familiar places, while the warmth of summer enveloped the land, the water, and the sky alike. Within him, imagination burned hot, emotion stirred deeply, and the clarity of his was gone adrift. The trees, the stars, the gentle air, they no longer felt like the familiar scenes of Galilee. Rather, they echoed the distant realm to which Balthasar had once fled in sorrow for mankind. The still lake reminded him of the sacred Nile, where that devout soul once stood in prayer when the radiant spirit appeared. Had Ben-Hur come to those very surroundings? Or had they somehow come to him? And what if the miracle returned? What if it was meant now for him? His heart trembled, caught between longing and fear. And yet, he waited, uncertain but open, quietly hoping for the vision. Only when the fever of thought cooled could he return to himself and begin to reason once more. His purpose in life, once carefully planned, now seemed in doubt. He had long reflected on his future as a soldier, even as a leader of revolution. But through all those reflections, one vast emptiness had persisted, an unspanned gap in his plan. Even if he rose through the ranks, even if he became both warrior and captain, what then? To what end would he direct his power? Rebellion seemed inevitable, but rebellion, he knew, demanded not just courage, but purpose. Revolutions require more than fury. They require a cause that binds followers and a goal that stirs hearts. The strongest fighter is not just the one who suffers wrong, but the one who sees beyond suffering, a vision worth bleeding for, dying for, remembered forever. To measure his goal, Ben-Hur turned to the only people who mattered, his own, the sons of Abraham, each one scarred by the same injustices, each one bearing sacred cause. The cause was certain, but the end, what was it truly? He had spent countless hours grappling with that question. Again and again, he returned only to a vague, glowing dream of liberty. Freedom for Israel. Was it enough? He dared not deny it, for that would crush his very hope. Yet he feared to embrace it completely, knowing how fragile it was. Could Israel alone challenge Rome? He had seen Rome's strength, its legions, its cunning, its cruel brilliance. A universal alliance might prevail, but even that seemed out of reach. Unless some heroic figure were to rise, drawn from among the oppressed, and through victory gain a name so mighty it shook the world. And what glory that would be, for Judea to be the birthplace of a new Alexander. But under the rabbis, there was zeal, yes, yet no discipline. And he remembered Messala's cruel taunt in the garden. All you conquer in 6 days, you lose on the 7th. The wound of those words still stung. Each time he approached the chasm of doubt, he was turned back. So often had he failed to answer the question of purpose that he had begun to leave it to fate. Perhaps the hero would appear in his time. Perhaps not. Only God knew. And in that state of mind, it's no surprise that Malach's brief recounting of Balthasar's tale struck Ben-Hur like a divine answer. Within that mysterious story, he felt the veil lift. The hero had been found at last, and he was no ordinary man, but a son of the lion tribe, king of the Jews. With a king, there must be a kingdom, and what a kingdom it would be. This king, like David, would fight gloriously. Like Solomon, he would rule with unmatched wisdom. His reign would rise like a storm against Rome, tearing its legions apart and bringing about not merely survival, but dominion. Yes, there would be war, a great upheaval, filled with agony and triumph. But in the end, peace. And that peace would be carved with the seal of Judea upon it. His heart pounded as a vision swept through him. Jerusalem, crowned as the capital of the world, and Zion, shining as the throne of the universal ruler. What fortune, he thought, that the man who had once seen this king with his own eyes was within the very tent he now walked toward. There, he could hear more, learn more, especially about the timing of the great change. If that time were near, then the campaign with Maxentius would be left behind, and he would begin gathering the tribes at once, arming them, preparing them, so that Israel might be ready when the dawn of restoration broke across the world. And now, with the full story told not by a messenger, but by Balthasar himself, was Ben-Hur satisfied? There was a shadow over him, one deeper than the shade of the palm grove. It was not merely a darkness of the body, but of the soul, a shadow cast by great uncertainty. And note this well, dear listener. This doubt reached beyond the king. It questioned the very nature of his kingdom. His mind turned inward. What kind of kingdom would it be? What was its purpose? These questions came early, and they would follow the child to the very end. They would outlive him on earth, lingering long after, unanswered by his generation. These were not simple questions. They were mysteries for those who cannot or will not see that every man is twofold, a mortal body and a soul that never dies. What is it to be? The thought echoed once more. We, today, may have the answer, but in Ben-Hur's heart, only the words of Balthasar remained, words describing a kingdom that would be on earth, yet not of it, not for men, but for their souls, a dominion of glory beyond imagination. So it was no surprise that these thoughts left him lost. For the young man, the vision felt more like a riddle, cloaked in darkness rather than light. He pondered, if no human hand would shape this kingdom, what role would men have in it? Would such a king need no workers, no counselors, no soldiers? Must the entire world fall or be created new? Would new ways of governing rise? Something beyond weapons? Something to replace force itself? But what? And again, listener, what we still choose not to see, he simply could not. The truth had not yet occurred to anyone. That love could govern better than might. That peace and order may be born, not through strength, but through compassion. As he sat lost in thought, a hand came to rest on his shoulder. The sheik stood beside him, speaking quietly but firmly. He had a final word to share before the night slipped away. Ben-Hur welcomed him. The sheik wasted no time. He told him to hold on to everything he had heard. except for the nature of the kingdom itself. That, he said, required a heart unshaped by others' dreams. He promised an introduction to Simonides, a merchant of Antioch, wise and trustworthy. He explained that the Egyptians' words were lovely, but dreamy, too perfect for the earth. Simonides, however, would speak with proof. He would open the books of the prophets and name each page. And Ben-Hur would see the child would indeed be a king, a real king, greater than Herod, more magnificent and divinely appointed. And with that, the sheik promised vengeance would at last be sweet. He ended with a blessing of peace and departed. Ben-Hur called after him, but the sheik did not return. Frustration settled in. Again, Simonides. His name echoed everywhere, spoken by one, then another. It felt as though Ben-Hur were being led by his father's old servant, a man who had managed to keep what was once his. Perhaps that made him wealthier, maybe even wiser, than the dream-filled Egyptian. But trust, once broken, should not be the path to find new faith. Ben-Hur resolved not to follow that way. Just then, he stopped. There was a sound. Singing. It drifted across the lake, soft, clear, almost divine. Was it a woman's voice or an angel's? It was hard to tell. The voice floated gently over the still water, as delicate as a flute, then stronger, closer. Soon, the rhythmic splash of oars was heard, slow and steady. And then the words came, sung in the purest Greek, the most graceful language of the time. A perfect vessel for deep sorrow. She sang of a distant homeland, a land beyond the Syrian sea. But her voice carried more than just words. It carried mourning. That land, once filled with fragrant winds from musky sands, had once given her life. Those winds had danced through the feathers of the palms, whispering to her spirit. But now, they belonged to memory. No longer would they stir for her again. Nor would the Nile, gliding in peace beneath the moon, weep past the ancient shore of Memphis. That gentle rhythm was now a song of loss. Still in her dreams, the river came back. It returned like a god to a soul that still longed for it. She saw herself once more, cradling a lotus bowl, just as in the days gone by. She would sing again, songs older than sorrow, songs that lived in her bones. And from the farthest corners of memory, she would hear it, the song of Memnon, the calls from beloved Simbel, echoes from her sacred past. But with the dawn came the pain. She would awaken, torn by a grief so fierce, it felt like a storm within her chest. And all of it, all her longing, all her love, all her farewell, was wrapped into that one last word. Farewell. The final note of the song faded as the boat slipped past the palm trees. That word, farewell, drifted past Ben-Hur's ears like a gentle wind, heavy with beauty and sorrow. And the boat itself, it passed like a shadow into deeper night. Ben-Hur breathed in. It was barely more than a sigh. He knew that voice. It belonged to the daughter of Balthasar, and the beauty of her voice matched only by the beauty of her presence. He recalled her face, the wide, soulful eyes, slightly veiled by lowered lids. Her cheeks, gently rounded with a soft, rosy glow. Her lips, full and alive with dimples near the corners. Her figure, tall, lithe, and full of grace. She was beautiful, and he felt it, not in thought, but in the sudden rhythm of his heart. Then, almost like a vision from the lake, another face appeared in his mind. Younger, equally radiant, gentler in spirit, softer in presence. Esther, and a smile came to him. As he had once wished, a star had been sent to him. He turned and walked slowly back toward the tent. His life until now had been filled with sorrow, with plans for vengeance, too full for love. But could this be the beginning of something new? And if a new feeling stirred in him, whose presence had left it behind? Both had come to him beneath the palms. Esther had offered him a cup, so had the Egyptian. And now, as he stepped into the tent, a question remained. Which one had touched his soul? And so ends the fourth book of this journey, where shadows of doubt loomed heavier than the desert palms, and the questions of the soul began to rise slowly, quietly, but unshakably. Ben-Hur stands at a threshold, haunted by prophecy, torn between vengeance and something far more tender. He begins to feel the stirrings of a different path, one that doesn't lead to power, but to purpose. And yet, the answer still hides in silence. Two women, two symbols, two moments under the same palms, and one heart, unsure of whom it now beats for. But the road ahead will not wait. New cities, new faces, and with them, deeper revelations. What truth lies with Simonides? Can the soul of a warrior open itself to love? And what destiny still sleeps in the shadow of the child's kingdom? The next chapter awaits. Stay with us, because Ben-Hur's journey is only just beginning. Subscribe to Echoes of Stories and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss the next stirring episode of this timeless saga.